What is the true history of Greek mythology? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life and every video immerses you in the destiny of those who have shaped the world. Today, let's trace the footsteps of a world where gods walked alongside mortals, Greek mythology, a universe of titans and immortals, heroes defying death, and monsters lurking in the shadows. Where Zeus' lightning bolts cleaved the sky, Poseidon made the sea tremble, and Athena whispered her secrets to the bravest. But behind these flamboyant tales, a question remains. Is Greek mythology merely a collection of legends, or is it a way to relive the past, to feel the heartbeat of a people who saw in every storm, every victory, every trial, the hand of the gods? But before embarking on another adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. From the middle of the 4th millennium before Christ, several flourishing civilizations emerged around the eastern Mediterranean basin and in more distant regions. These precede by several centuries the formation of the great Greek myths and form a vast cultural horizon where exchanges multiplied. At the center of this panorama lies Pharaonic Egypt, whose political unification was consolidated around 3100 before Christ. Under the reign of successive dynasties, marked by their sacred sovereigns, Egypt developed a religion centered on gods in human or animal form, linked to the fertility of the Nile, sovereignty, as well as the posthumous survival ensured by elaborate funerary practices. Along the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon emerged as other major centers of civilization. Here, cuneiform writing was used from the end of the 4th millennium, allowing the drafting of administrative documents, religious chronicles, and mythological texts narrating cosmogonic tales and epics of hero kings like Gilgamesh. Mesopotamia also witnessed the reign of great empires, notably under Sargon of Akkad around 2300 before Christ, and later under Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century before Christ. These sovereigns erected vast temples in honor of earthly and celestial deities, while developing law codes that sacralized their royal authority. Further west, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire emerged in the 2nd millennium before Christ, building fortresses, perfecting the handling of the horse and chariot, and worshipping storm gods directly linked to climatic phenomena. The Hittites occupied a strategic position connecting the Aegean world and the Levant, where the Canaanite city-states flourished. In the coastal region of the Levant, various kingdoms developed the cult of Baal, a god associated with the storm and fertility, while other deities presided over harvests, births, or the health of the community. On the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the Canaanites evolved in direct contact with Egypt, frequenting its ports and sometimes imitating its sacred architecture. Similarly, the Syrian and Palestinian populations received Mesopotamian influences in their religious traditions. Further away, in the south of Asia, the Indus Valley housed planned cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, where they built citadels, ritual baths, and standardized housing. Writing in a pictographic system not yet deciphered, these societies revealed a hierarchical organization and a probable pantheon, although few certainties remain about them. To the east, in China's early dynasties, beginning with the Xia dynasty around 2100 before Christ, the structure was built around warrior chiefs, ancestor rites, and prototypes of writing on bones or turtle shells, which demonstrated a special relationship with spirits and celestial forces. At the heart of these different cultural areas, we find shared beliefs rooted in the observation of natural elements. Storm, water, and earth deities dominate the religious imagination, while rulers present themselves as the guarantors of cosmic balance. Egyptian kings declare themselves sons of Ra, the solar god, while those of Mesopotamia claim to have received their power from Marduk or Enlil. Everywhere, rituals are celebrated in temples designed to embody the connection between the community and its celestial protectors, with altars, statues, or relics serving as supports for divine presence. The rituals include processions, offerings, and sometimes sacred dances, punctuated by poetic recitations that celebrate the creation of the world and the victory over chaos. In each of these contexts, the figure of the hero king is essential as it demonstrates the ability to overcome the forces of nature and impose a benevolent prosperity. Trade between these civilizations intensifies starting in the second millennium before Christ. The Eastern Mediterranean becomes a zone for the circulation of metals, ivory, amber, and other precious materials. The ports of the Levant and those of the Aegean serve as hubs where large-scale transactions take place. Merchants transport luxury goods, but also religious practices and artistic styles. Minoan navigators, based in Crete, sail the Aegean Sea and establish trading posts as far as Asia Minor. The Mycenaeans, located on the Greek mainland, become important intermediaries, benefiting from the gradual adaptation of war chariots and a navy capable of navigating the open sea. Through these flows, ideas about the structure of the cosmos, the king's place, or the identity of the gods are transmitted from community to community. In this vast ensemble, cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, and linear A then B in the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds radically change the way knowledge is stored and transmitted. The use of bronze, essential for weaponry and many tools, becomes a marker of power and wealth, leading to a strong demand for copper and tin, often imported from distant regions. Palace cities, like those of Knossos or Paistos in Crete, combine centralized administration, religious worship, and artisanal production. In the Mycenaean case, Mycenaean pylos illustrate the political model of a military aristocracy, ensuring the fortification of sites and the coordination of resources. Sanctuaries integrated into these complexes welcome protector gods and cement the group's unity, both spiritually and socially. Mythical themes reappear in these different contexts. Divine battles against hostile creatures, narratives of creative or destructive floods, and the figure of the mother goddess reveal common concerns. Storm gods, pillars of the local pantheon in several regions, symbolize celestial intervention in the human world. Hadad, Baal, Tarhun, and later Zeus become reference points for describing the sky's wrath and lightning. The peoples of the Aegean, inspired by these mythologies, will adapt certain motifs, like the story of a water cataclysm or the confrontation between primordial powers and a new sovereign god. The notion of influence is complex, because these myths often circulate via partial texts, diplomatic encounters, or exotic objects charged with sacred images. In Crete, hilltop sanctuaries reveal the importance of the natural world in religious life. Installed on heights, they dominate the horizon and serve as gathering places for processions and offerings. The presence of ritual objects, such as human figurines, votive axes, or bronze hooks, shows devotion to tutelary powers associated with the mountain or the fertility of the land. The cult of the bull, illustrated by ceremonial bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos, and the use of consecration horns, sets the stage for stories like that of the Minotaur, which Greek tradition will later evoke. On the mainland, Mycenae, Tiryns, or Argos also present sacred places, sometimes linked to the deceased and to the royal dynasty, while the decoration of their tombs reflects a symbolic universe marked by military strength and family ties. In this Aegean world, the variety of cult practices anticipates the future diversity of Greek myths. Local deities, honored in caves or near springs, gradually merge with more widely known entities, thus forming a syncretic religious repertoire. Minoan frescoes depict processions, ritual activities, and female deities without direct equivalents in the later Olympian pantheon, but which may be integrated as protective goddesses or figures governing fertility. The Mycenaeans, whose linear B script attests to the mention of certain already familiar divine names like Zeus, Poseidon, and Potnia, also participate in this crucible where varied sacred narratives are foreshadowed. When the Bronze Age ends, around 1200 before Christ, the collapse of palaces and population movements do not abolish these beliefs. They are maintained in collective memory and are reshaped at renewed, sometimes more modest sanctuaries, where offerings are perpetuated through generations. Ultimately, Greek mythology draws its origins from the Aegean cultural humus, blending Minoan and Mycenaean contributions with Eastern influences. Before 1200 before Christi, beliefs and divine figures circulate through maritime trade, the rise of palaces, and diplomatic contacts. This dynamic nourishes future poems and shapes a pantheon in constant dialogue with the legends of major neighbors. Archaic poets, messengers of the oral tradition, will synthesize these diverse heritages into a sacred corpus where gods and heroes mingle with a tradition already enriched by multiple influences. On Aegean territories, before the crystallization of classical Greek mythology, two great civilizations developed, profoundly marking the Hellenic imagination: the Minoans in Crete, around 2000 before Christ, and the Mycenaeans on the mainland of Greece around 1600. Among the former, we observe a cult centered on goddesses linked to fertility, often depicted holding snakes, and on unique architectural elements such as horns of consecration. The colorful frescoes of Knossos, Phaistos, or Malia portray ritual processions and bull-leaping scenes where acrobats challenge the bull. This motif, emblematic of Minoan culture, will reappear in the mythic figure of the Minotaur, a creature that will later symbolize the encounter between a world still imbued with ancient practices and Athenian heroism. Although Minoan writing, namely Linear A, remains undeciphered, its remnants suggest a solid palatial organization focused on collective rituals and a strong devotion directed to female divinities. Around 1600, Minoan preponderance erodes, yielding to the Mycenaean civilization, whose major centers are Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. The fortresses built on strategic heights, along with Tholos tombs, testify to the military power and influence of their kings. The tablets in Linear B, the first written form of the Greek language, attest to the existence of an already recognizable pantheon. One can spot Potinija, mistress goddess, and Dai-Waijo, an archaic form of Zeus. This Mycenaean world values warfare, as shown by bronze armaments and tales of great deeds that Homer will sing in the form of grand epics. Princely burial, associated with the possession of riches and sumptuous weapons, crystallizes the image of leaders both close to the gods and sources of heroic legends. Argos, Mycenae, and Thebes already appear as memory sites, where prestigious dynasties take root and will later nourish the grand cycles of the oral tradition. The Mycenaean culture maintains the veneration of ancestors regarded as founders. In some tombs, offerings have been found post-dating the burial, suggesting an ancestor cult. These practices inspire the formation of narratives around semi-divine figures, warriors who may have protected the city, providential kings at the origin of dynasties. Heroes such as Heracles or Perseus might have their seeds in these traditions before gaining the epic scope we know today. The idea of semi-divine ancestry also serves to legitimize the power of certain families, who proudly display legendary ancestors to bolster their prestige. Gradually, these stories coalesce and feed the great regional sagas, connecting Argos, Mycenae, or Thebes to august lineages meant to inspire future generations of poets. Around 1200 before Christ, an upheaval hit the entire Aegean world. The Mycenaean palaces collapse, and the trade networks fall apart. Multiple factors, including internal tensions, external attacks, or natural disasters, precipitate the fall of this palatial civilization. Populations flee or resettle in less exposed sites, taking with them their beliefs and sometimes modifying former rituals. The decay of centralized power accelerates the fragmentation of religious practices. Smaller sanctuaries, nestled in remote areas, nevertheless perpetuate certain ancient traditions. Historians and archaeologists perceive through sporadic discoveries the persistence of local deities to whom offerings continue to be made. This crisis phase also sees the arrival of new influences, creating fertile ground for the reconfiguration of cults, while the memory of the vanished palaces nourishes epic tales. Despite the collapse, religious survivals persist. Caves, already revered in the Minoan era, continue to receive offerings, as do certain sacred springs or mountain peaks. Local communities, deprived of palatial administration, adapt and preserve ancient rites, sometimes merging them with new forms of devotion. Female deities linked to fertility are maintained, while the figure of the storm god, perhaps inherited from Anatolian borrowings, gradually gains importance. Under various names, deities with similar functions ensure group cohesion, favor the harvest, or protect travelers. Over time, these regional beliefs merge, creating multiple faces for the same god, depending on the locality and tradition from which it inherits. Trade and cultural exchanges, despite the turbulence, maintain a network linking Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt to the Aegean world. Anatolian storm gods, similar to the Hittite Teshub, find echoes in the future Zeus, while the Levantine goddess Astarte anticipates certain attributes of Aphrodite. Later, the veneration of Isis and Serapis, imported from Egypt, will testify to an accomplished syncretism in the Hellenistic world. This circulation of religious ideas is reflected in myths by recurring common themes: divine struggles against primordial monsters, flood narratives, or maternal figures at the origin of life. In this effervescence, the Greeks adapt and reinterpret, gradually forging a composite pantheon, where endogenous beliefs and exogenous contributions intertwine. The so-called Greek mythology thus results from a progressive aggregation. It draws from a pre-Hellenic substratum nourished by the Minoans, enriched by the Mycenaeans, and then modulated by multiple exchanges within the Mediterranean. Emerging from the Dark Ages, Homeric and Hesiodic poets gather these fragmentary traditions, forge them into coherent narratives, and bequeath them to posterity. Each region, each sanctuary, brings its nuance, offering this or that god a particular face. Under the pen of the rhapsodes, local legends like those of Argos or Crete merge into a common thread. It is this plurality, sometimes contradictory, that enriches Greek mythology, where one can still recognize the strength of old scattered cults and the mark of foreign influences, aggregated and sublimated by poetry. In the diversity of these contributions, the epic narratives stage a succession of divine and heroic figures, whose identity sometimes merges with ancient local powers. The poets, in animating chants and offerings, convey to the public images of polyform gods. Chaos opens the Greek creation story as a vast primordial abyss, an unfathomable void that precedes all established order. Unlike mere confusion, chaos is presented as the gigantic space where the first entities will be born. Among them appear Erebus, identified with the darkness of the depths, and Nyx, the personification of the night. These two powers suggest the idea of an initial darkness enveloping the forming universe. Next comes Gaia, the Earth, considered a nurturing and autonomous feminine deity. Unlike monotheistic narratives where creation depends on a single god, the ancient Greek world sees the Earth emerge on its own, without being engendered by a superior power. Gaia presents herself as the solid foundation upon which future evolutions will rest. In this embryonic universe, each entity has its role. Chaos serves as an unlimited matrix. Erebus and Nyx institute darkness, while Gaia becomes the tangible basis of all existence. Uranos, the personification of the sky, emerges to envelop Gaia and form the first cosmic union. He covers the Earth like an infinite celestial dome, ensuring a total fusion between the above and the below. From this alliance are born the Titans, Cyclopes, and Hecatoncheires, powerful creatures trapped in the entrails of Gaia. Uranos, fearing their strength, keeps them locked up. Gaia, angered, urges Kronos, the youngest Titan, to attack. Armed with a sickle, he mutilates his father, and thus separates the sky from the earth. From the blood of Uranos, new entities arise, while the seed cast into the sea gives birth to Aphrodite. This violent act establishes Kronos as the new sovereign. The celestial terrestrial rupture symbolizes the ordering of the cosmos, for only the separation of these principles allows for the flourishing of life. Greek mythology thus presents initial violence as a necessary engine of creation. The Titans, children of Uranos and Gaia, dominate the scene as soon as Kronos gains power. They are often described as 12 primordial deities, each associated with a natural or cosmic principle. Kronos, the most famous, reigns with his sister Rhea, while his brothers and sisters include Oceanus, master of currents, or Themis, linked to order and justice. Alongside them are the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants, renowned for their skill in forging lightning. The Hecatoncheires bear 100 arms and 50 heads. Detained by Uranos and then freed, these beings embody the raw power of nature. In ancient understanding, Titans, Cyclopes, and Hecatoncheires constitute various facets of creation, celestial and subterranean forces that coexist without yet being hierarchized. Their apparition witnesses a world in constant expansion, where several divine generations coexist before Olympus prevails. Each group expresses a facet of the cosmos, from oceans to climatic phenomena. The theme of stacking illustrates how Uranos, out of fear, suppresses his own children, locking Titans, Cyclopes, and Hecatoncheires in the depths. He triggers latent disorder within Gaia, forced to contain these immense forces. Ancient tales depict a groaning Earth, bending under the divine overload. This tension reaches its peak when Gaia conceives the plan that will allow Kronos to free his brothers and sisters. The act of violence against Uranos then becomes an emancipatory gesture, breaking the grip that paralyzed the Earth. In this cosmogony, oppression often results from the will of a power to control the development of new forces. The stacking serves as a metaphor. An overflow of confined potential eventually explodes. From a modern perspective, this story illustrates how Greek myths imagined creation as a process of rupture. Only radical, even violent initiative can end the initial blockage. This motif highlights the internal dynamics of the cosmos, where contained energy always ends up freeing itself from what constrains it. In Greek traditions, cosmogony is not limited to divine origins. It also serves as a conceptual map of the world. The mountains, stemming from Gaia's body, are seen as junction points between the celestial realm and the inhabited earth. The seas, later dominated by Poseidon, originate from the primordial flows that Oceanus already symbolizes during the Titanic era. Rivers, like the Styx, hold a sacred character, marking the boundaries between life and death. This geographical network is paired with a celestial organization, where each deity occupies a specific sphere of influence. The ancient Greeks read their myths as a sacred geography. Each relief, each watercourse, each island found its explanation in the activity of a specific divine entity. Through these narratives, nature unfolds in the form of divine agents presiding over the multiple facets of human existence. Forests, caves, and even winds are often personified, giving a spiritual relief to the Mediterranean topography. The Greek myths, while remaining unique, do not develop in a vacuum. Throughout the ancient Near East, there are stories of deities fighting against primordial monsters or ancient powers. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Enuma Elish epic shows Marduk confronting the goddess Tiamat, incarnation of marine chaos. In Anatolia, the Hittites speak of the storm god's battle against archaic forces, while in Ugarit, Baal triumphs over monstrous entities. Without going into details, Greek mythology resonates with these themes, offering in turn structuring battles. Uranos and Kronos, or later Zeus and the Titans, illustrate a succession of cosmic confrontations. Maritime and cultural exchanges throughout the Mediterranean may have facilitated borrowings and reinterpretations. For the people of the time, telling such divine conflicts allowed them to explain the order of the world by opposing it to an initial chaos. The victory of a new cosmic sovereign then became the guarantee of universal stability. At the heart of this cosmogony, a guiding idea emerges. The universe finds its coherence in the succession of divine reigns, each redistributing powers until the establishment of a stable order. The first emergences, from chaos to the Titans, lay the foundations of a world where matter and natural forces disengage from the formless. Kronos' action against Uranos opens the way to a titanic era, marked by the reign of Gaia's children. However, this order remains fragile. Indeed, Kronos' brutality and his fear of being overthrown lead him to devour his own children. The cosmogony here serves as a prelude, justifying the future rise of Zeus. Greek poets will present Zeus's advent as the final stage, where the divine hierarchy is organized in relative harmony. One finds a mythical justification for legitimate power. If Zeus reigns, it is because he resolves the conflict inherited from Kronos to his advantage. The cosmogony establishes the principle that the universe, after many convulsions, must reach a form of stability under the authority of an undisputed divine dynasty and establishes a social and protective order. After the immense cosmogonic gesture that witnessed the birth of Gaia, who is the Earth, of Uranos, the sky, and the emergence of many primordial entities, a new major episode is being prepared, the advent of Zeus, the future sovereign of the Greek pantheon. Before understanding how he imposes himself, one must remember the role of his father, the Titan Kronos, who then reigned over the universe. According to tradition, Kronos began to devour his children at birth, fearing they might one day threaten his power. This was an act of absolute terror, imposed at the initiative of Gaia, who cherished provisional stability, but primarily used by Kronos to counter prophecies announcing his downfall. In this context, Rhea, his wife, could not bear the loss of all her newborns. She then devised a plan to save the last of them, young Zeus. Rhea's ruse consisted of substituting a swaddled stone for the child, which she presented to Kronos for him to devour while hiding Zeus in a safe place. The stories diverge regarding the exact location of his retreat. Some claim he was raised in the cave of Mount Dicto in Crete, nourished by the milk of the goat Amalthea, and protected by guards called curates, who clashed their shields to cover the infant's cries. Whatever the variations, the essence remains. The child escaped his father's jaws and was able to grow in secret. Once an adult, Zeus returned to claim his place and, with the help of his mother, managed to make Kronos regurgitate all the brothers and sisters he had previously swallowed. The overthrow of the father was underway. A decisive step was the liberation of Zeus's allies, unjustly imprisoned by Kronos, or, according to other versions, by Uranus himself. Among them were the Cyclopes, legendary craftsmen with a single eye, and the Hecatoncheires, creatures with 100 arms and 50 heads. These gigantic beings, relegated to the depths of Tartarus, represented a colossal force that awaited a new master. In gratitude for their release, the Cyclopes offered Zeus the ultimate weapon, lightning. His brothers also received gifts. Poseidon inherited the trident, and Hades obtained the helmet of invisibility. Armed with these assets, Zeus could organize a siege against Kronos and the Titans, established on the heights of Olympus. The ensuing confrontation foreshadowed a long and exhausting conflict, the Titanomachy. The Titanomachy lasted 10 whole years, an immense period for immortal beings. On one side were the Titans loyal to Kronos, powerful but divided, and on the other, Zeus led his brothers and sisters into combat, supported by the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes. Ancient texts describe violent tremors shaking the earth, while the waves, mountains, and sky echoed with crashes. In the end, victory belonged to Zeus, who managed to coordinate his troops and utilize the prodigious energy of his allies. The defeated Titans were punished. Most were thrown into Tartarus, under the vigilant guard of the Hecatoncheires. To seal this triumph, Zeus had to organize the division of the world with his brothers. He retained sovereignty of the sky, Poseidon obtained the sea, and Hades now reigned over the realm of the dead. However, their new reign was not completely assured. Another generation of rivals emerged, this time from the blood trickling from Uranus's wound at the moment of his castration. From this outflow were born the giants, massive and brutal beings endowed with titanic strength. These new enemies, vexed by Zeus's ascendancy, challenged the established order by attempting to assault Olympus. This episode is known as the Gigantomachy. The Olympians had to fight fiercely, as many oracles stipulated that human aid would be required to defeat these forces. Heracles, a hero born of a union between Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, was called to the rescue. Thanks to his superhuman strength and formidable arrows, he helped the gods thwart the giants' conquering momentum. The main adversaries, like Alcyoneus and Porphyrion, fell under the blows jointly dealt by Heracles and Zeus. After this gigantic battle, another formidable adversary appeared, Typhon, considered the most terrifying creature engendered by Gaia. Sometimes described with serpent heads emerging from his limbs and a fiery breath, Typhon challenged Zeus's might with unmatched rage. According to some mythographers, he even managed to tear out Zeus's tendons during an initial skirmish, forcing the god to temporarily retreat. Eventually, with the support of Hermes and the return of his strength, Zeus was able to regain the upper hand. The final combat was so fierce that it was said the volcanoes of Sicily, notably Etna, resulted from Typhon's defeated body buried beneath the earth. By this ultimate victory, Zeus definitively legitimized himself as the absolute master, not only before the Titans, but also against the monsters born from the earth's depths. To consolidate his reign, Zeus surrounded himself with two essential figures linked to the principles of wisdom and balance, Metis and Themis. Metis, whose name means cunning or prudence, was once Zeus's wife, but tradition tells that he absorbed her to prevent her from birthing a potential rival. From this union, however, he retained her sharp intellect and the ability to discern the best strategy when faced with a challenge. Themis, for her part, represented divine justice and immutable order. She presided over sacred rites and watched over the harmony of cosmic laws. By associating himself with these two powers, Zeus placed his authority under the sign of reason and the maintenance of a global balance. Yet, this stability did not erase the impetuosity of certain gods, nor the disagreements that could punctuate the Olympian councils. At the end of these successive trials, Zeus imposed a new era. His victories over Cronus, the Titans, the Giants, and Typhon confirmed his supremacy, while his unions with various deities and mortals forged an extensive network of alliances. Each combat, each cosmic battle, contributed to the establishment of an order where the gods occupied specific functions, from celestial lightning to marine waves or subterranean depths. Now supported by a varied entourage, Zeus was prepared to exercise a power recognizable both in the divine realm and in the lives of mortals, who regularly invoked his name in prayer and sacrifice. Although crowned with success, his reign would not eliminate all tension, for Olympus, united under his authority, would remain a place of intrigue and passion. Over time, mortals would recognize in these tales a celestial hierarchy, where Zeus's power remained uncontested, but where jealousy, ambition, and desires animated the divine court. Consequently, the Olympian era opened, stable yet traversed by measured conflicts. The vast family of Olympian gods, mostly born from the union of the Titan Cronus and the Titaness Rhea, embodied in the eyes of the ancient Greeks the great forces at work in the universe. At the top of this group stood Zeus, whose omnipotence stemmed from his victory during the Titanomachy. As the celestial sovereign, he ruled over atmospheric phenomena, justice, and cosmic harmony. His main attributes, such as the lightning bolt and the scepter, are often depicted in ancient statuary and pottery. Artists, for an audience sometimes ignorant of this pantheon's mysteries, preferred to emphasize his majestic air and noble bearing. He is easily distinguished by his full beard and the lightning he brandishes when the storm roars. The Greeks often call him the Olympian Zeus, in reference to Mount Olympus, the divine seat and symbol of his preeminence. Hera, sister and wife of Zeus, personifies feminine sovereignty and the protection of marriage. Her role proves essential in Greek society, where conjugal bonds hold significant importance. Myths highlight her jealous nature. She tolerates neither Zeus's infidelity nor the children he fathers with mortals. Among the legendary figures struck by her wrath are Io, a young priestess forced into exile in the form of a white heifer, and Semele, the mortal mother of Dionysus, whose tragic demise is partly due to the goddess's anger. However, Hera protects married women and presides over nuptial rites. In art, she is recognized by her diadem, sometimes accompanied by a poppy or a peacock, the sacred bird symbolizing her royal dignity. Poseidon, another brother of Zeus, reigns over the seas and oceans. The Greeks, a people of navigators, honor him as the master of the waves and implore his benevolence before setting out to sea. He is often called the Earth Shaker because he causes earthquakes by striking his trident on the ground. In coastal cities, numerous sanctuaries arise to attract his protection. He also presides over horses, considered noble beasts linked to movement and strength, probably an echo to the fierceness of the waves. Poseidon remains a formidable god. His fiery nature appears in several episodes, notably when he punishes boastful sailors or opposes other deities for the possession of a city, as was the case in Athens against Athena. Demeter, goddess of fertility and the harvests, ensures the abundance necessary for humanity. She is associated with wheat and grains that nourish humans. In sanctuaries dedicated to her, sacred mysteries are celebrated, particularly at Eleusis near Athens. Although this specific rite is not detailed here, her role in the growth of crops fits into the annual cycle of the seasons. The myths explain this cycle by the abduction of Demeter's daughter, Persephone, who spends part of the year in the underworld. The goddess's anger and sadness then translate into the barrenness of fields during winter. She is often depicted with a sheaf of wheat or a torch, symbolizing the search for Persephone. Athena, daughter of Zeus, occupies a unique place in this pantheon. According to legend, she is born fully armed from her father's skull, after he swallowed Metis, the goddess of cunning wisdom. This genesis expresses Athena's privileged relationship with reflection and strategic skill, both on the battlefield and in the arts. She protects cities, notably Athens, where she is revered under the name Athena Polias. Offerings and processions in her honor punctuate civic life, as she embodies the intelligence necessary for politics and prudence in combat. Her typical iconography represents her wearing a helmet, holding a spear, and the aegis adorned with the head of Medusa. The owl, her emblematic animal, illustrates the insight and vigilance she displays. Apollo, god of music, divination, and harmonious beauty, is another child of Zeus, fathered with the Titaness Leto. His twin sister, Artemis, is more particularly attached to hunting and the protection of wild spaces. Apollo has a solar character, sometimes bright and healing, sometimes severe and punitive when disrespected. At Delphi, where his most famous sanctuary stands, he fulfills the role of Apollo Pythian, guarantor of the oracles dispensed by the Pythia. Greek cities regularly send delegations to consult the future with this god. He is recognized by the lyre, symbolizing his artistic gifts, and his bow, a tool of chastisement for the insolent. As for Artemis, she reigns over wildlife, protects youth, but punishes any disrespectful intrusion into her forests. Her bow and quiver, sometimes accompanied by a deer, distinguish her in painted or sculpted representations. Ares, son of Zeus and Hera, personifies the brutal warrior spirit and the tumult of battles. Unlike Athena, who is a thoughtful strategist, Ares embodies the bloody aspect of combat. The Greeks fear him and rarely represent him in a favorable light. Some stories recount his affair with Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and love, from which sometimes arise allegorical entities, such as Eros, representing love or harmony. Aphrodite, for her part, comes from two different traditions. For Hesiod, she springs from the foam, born of the violent act carried out by Kronos against Uranus, while Homer presents her as the daughter of Zeus and Dione. In any case, this goddess radiates passion and inspires desire. Her favorite flower is the myrtle, and her sacred birds are the dove and the sparrow. Her enchantment power is manifested in iconography by idealized nudity, or the presence of Eros by her side. Hephaestus, god of fire and metallurgy, is described as the celestial craftsman capable of forging weapons and jewelry for the gods. A son of Zeus and Hera in most versions, he is sometimes born weakened, which would explain his limp. Some myths state that, rejected from heaven by his mother, he falls to earth and develops his art in volcanic depths. Sanctuaries are dedicated to this god, protector of blacksmiths and artisans. He is depicted with a hammer and tongs, often in front of an anvil. Hephaestus also appears in a famous anecdote in which he lays invisible nets to catch Aphrodite and Ares in the act of adultery, thus exposing their fault to the other gods. This episode recalls the internal tensions in the Olympian pantheon, where passion and jealousy reign behind the scenes. Hermes, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, is born in the early morning and immediately proves his cunning. Still an infant, he steals a herd of cattle belonging to Apollo, then invents the lyre by sacrificing one of the animals and stretching its gut over a tortoise shell. This initial scene symbolizes Hermes' ingenuity and sly nature. He embodies the god of travelers, merchants, and communication. His distinctive attribute is the caduceus, a staff adorned with two entwined serpents, which becomes the emblem of diplomacy and negotiation. He also wears winged sandals that allow him to move with incredible speed, serving Zeus's urgent messages. Xenia, that is, sacred hospitality, is also under his benevolence. Dionysus, on the other hand, is distinguished by a double birth. In a first stage, he is conceived by Zeus with Semele, a mortal princess. Hera, jealous, leads Semele to demand to see Zeus in all his splendor, which instantly strikes her down. Dionysus, not yet full term, is saved by his father by being enclosed in his thigh, hence the expression born twice. God of wine, intoxication, and collective enthusiasm, he symbolizes unbridled creativity and the transgression of social limits. His noisy processions, accompanied by satyrs and maenads, reflect the festive and exuberant spirit associated with his cult. Artistic representations often depict him as a young man crowned with ivy and holding a thyrsus, a staff adorned with foliage, while wine flows abundantly in his honor. These 12 Olympians become visible in iconography through attributes that ensure their immediate identification. Zeus wields the thunderbolt, Poseidon the trident, Hermes his caduceus, Athena her owl and her aegis, Apollo his lyre, Artemis her bow, and so on. The religious function also determines cultic toponymies, meaning place names that affirm the local anchoring of each deity. In Athens, Athena bears the epithet Polias, protector of the city. In Olympia, Zeus is worshipped under the Olympian title, especially during the Pan-Hellenic Games. In Delphi, Apollo is called Pythian, recalling his victory over the serpent Python. These geographical dedications highlight the territorialization of the sacred, each city valuing the god or goddess whose protection it claims. Beyond artistic manifestations, these deities occupy vital social functions in Greek collective life. Political or legal oaths rely on divine guarantee. Anyone who perjures offends the sacred justice of Zeus. Hospitality, called Xenia, under the watchful eye of Hermes and Zeus, presents itself as a civic and moral duty. The traveler is received, fed, and protected in the hope that the gods will reward the host's kindness. Demeter presides over fertility on which the subsistence of a rural community depends, while Athena and Hephaestus guard craftsmanship, technique, and material creation. War, under the protection of Ares and Athena, is both destruction and an affirmation of a city's power, moderated or not by the strategic dimension. Navigation, crucial for a civilization turned toward the Mediterranean, falls under the benevolence of Poseidon, whose anger can break any ship. Music, left to Apollo, is conceived not only as a form of entertainment, but also as a harmonious order capable of composing the soul and educating the youth. Within Greek mythology, the question of humanity and its place in the universe holds significant importance. For an international audience unfamiliar with these tales, it is useful to first examine the myth of Prometheus, which illustrates the tension between divine wisdom and human quest for autonomy. The ancient Greeks, notably in the 8th century before Christ, transmitted these legends through poems attributed to Hesiod. Through his writings, this poet laid the foundations for reflection on the origins of good and evil. The figure of Prometheus thus symbolizes the ambivalence of the rebellious hero, protector of men and transgressor of divine limits. According to tradition, Prometheus was a Titan, meaning a member of the divine generation prior to that of the Olympians. At Mycenaean, a sacred place where the first interactions between gods and mortals were negotiated, he is said to have orchestrated a deception during a banquet. As Zeus and the other Olympian deities were to choose which portion of the sacrificed animal belonged to them, Prometheus arranged the flesh and bones in a misleading way. He wrapped the meat in an unattractive appearance and covered the lean portion with a beautiful coating of fat. Zeus, deceived, chose the outwardly attractive portion, leaving the nourishing meat to humans. This act established the sacrificial sharing. Outraged by this ruse, Zeus punished humanity by taking away fire, a major symbol of warmth, technology, and survival. Prometheus, determined to help humans, secretly entered Olympus and stole a spark that he hid in a hollow stem before bringing it to Earth. This theft of fire marked a decisive turning point. From then on, humans could cook their food, warm themselves in less hospitable regions, and forge metal tools. However, by breaking the divine taboo, Prometheus incurred the wrath of Zeus, who condemned him to perpetual torture. Chained to a rock, he endured the daily assault of an eagle devouring his liver. This exemplary punishment highlights the ambiguity of the Titan. Revered by mortals for his generosity, he remains a troublemaker in the eyes of the celestial authority. In Greek culture, Prometheus embodies both inventive genius and the rebel who defies the order established by the gods. His act confirms that the gods, despite their power, can be deceived, and that humans, though infinitely more fragile, possess the cunning and creativity necessary to shape their destiny. This theme of the punished benefactor will be found in other episodes of mythology, but it takes on a particular significance here because it is part of the same narrative as that of Pandora. Also mentioned by Hesiod, Pandora holds a crucial place in explaining the evils that befall humanity. Her name means the one who holds all gifts, as each Olympian deity is said to have bestowed her with a talent or characteristic. Zeus sent her among humans as a seemingly benevolent gift, but one with hidden intentions. Indeed, she carried with her a large container, often referred to as a jar called pythos in Greek, and not a simple box, contrary to later tradition. Out of curiosity or mythical compulsion, Pandora opened this container, releasing a multitude of plagues, diseases, sufferings, and other irreparable distress. The most famous aspect of this opening, however, lies in the presence of hope, personified or not, which remained at the bottom of the jar after the hasty closure of the lid. Interpretations diverge. For some, hope is a good that would have protected humanity from desolation. For others, it represents an additional illusion, preserved with the evils. In any case, this myth underscores the vulnerability of man to his own impulses and the difficulty in mastering what escapes mortal understanding. Pandora's actions, driven by curiosity, thus serve as a mirror of human limitations, reinforcing the need for constant caution. In his work titled Works and Days, Hesiod also presents the concept of the 5 ages of the world. According to this account, humanity successively goes through eras marked by increasing moral and material degradation. The first age, the Age of Gold, is described as an idyllic time when men lived without pain, close to the gods, in lasting peace. The Age of Silver sees the appearance of neglect towards the sacred and non-respect of religious duties. The Age of Bronze, more violent, is characterized by the exaltation of brute force. The Age of Heroes constitutes a parenthesis where valiant demigods, such as Achilles or Diomedes, emerge. Finally, the Age of Iron corresponds to Hesiod's own time, where men must toil to subsist and endure wars, injustices, and repeated trials. Virtues become rare, piety towards the deities declines, and humanity sinks into a cycle of conflicts. Through this classification, the poet presents a somber portrait of the human condition, yet invites his contemporaries to maintain a connection with the gods through rigorous sacrificial practices and the fulfillment of honest work. Even if these 5 ages belong to a mythical vision, they convey the perception of a gradual fall from an initial state of bliss towards an uncertain future. In the continuation of these stories about humanity, the Greek tradition also recounts a devastating flood, sometimes compared to the Mesopotamian or biblical accounts. This catastrophe is linked to Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha, daughter of Prometheus and Pandora. When Zeus, angered by widespread corruption, decided to flood the world, only Deucalion and Pyrrha survived by building an ark or finding refuge on a boat. After the waters receded, they consulted an oracle to find out how to repopulate the earth. The oracle instructed them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders, which they interpreted as stones drawn from the earth. By performing this ritual gesture, Deucalion and Pyrrha watched the stones transform into human beings, thus initiating a new cycle of life. Through this rebirth, mythology emphasizes the idea that even after extremely severe divine punishments, humanity has a chance to start anew on healthier grounds. This story resonates with universal themes: collective fault, the anger of a deity, submersion by waters, and regeneration after catastrophe. For the Greek world, it also illustrates the initiatory dimension of the trials that survivors undergo. By agreeing to obey an oracle, they demonstrate their humility and their willingness to amend. The Greeks saw destiny as being subject to the Moirai, while Nemesis corrected hubris and exalted Sophrosyne. Through work, sacrifice, and ritual exchange, humans entered into an implicit pact with Olympus. Thus, between beast and god, each was always called to observe the right measure. In ancient Greece, the religious landscape was organized around various sacred spaces and practices that structured both collective life and the symbolic order. The central rite, called Thysia, constituted one of the most important moments of civic piety. It involved a sacrifice during which an animal, usually an ox or a sheep, was offered to the gods on the altar of a sanctuary. The Greeks believed that by burning the bones and fat, the smoke rising to the sky nourished the deity, while the cooked flesh served as food during a communal feast. This act thus shared the portions between the divine sphere and the community, affirming a mutual contractual bond. By honoring the deity, it protected the city, ensured the fertility of the fields, and maintained prosperity. For an audience unfamiliar with these rites, it is important to note that the Thesia represented not only a religious gesture, but also a manifestation of political and social solidarity. To organize these sacrifices, the cities established festive calendars, punctuated by specific celebrations related to this or that god. Among the most famous, we find the Pantheon, dedicated to Athena, the tutelary goddess of Athens. In this context, athletic and musical competitions took place in honor of the goddess, and the great sacrifice of a herd of oxen marked the climax of the festival. Likewise, the Dionysia, celebrated in honor of Dionysus, manifested through joyful processions, theatrical performances, and wine libations. The Thesmophoria, on the other hand, were linked to Demeter and were especially for married women, who prayed for the fertility of the lands and the good fruition of crops. Each of these festivals reinforced civic cohesion by allowing the participation of all categories of the population, dramatizing the encounter between human and divine, and renewing bonds within the city. However, the Greeks did not content themselves with celebrating their gods within the festive framework. Beyond public ceremonies, they also sought to dialogue with higher powers to know the future or obtain advice. The sanctuary of Delphi, dedicated to Apollo, was the most prestigious. The Pythia, priestess of the god, was consulted there, delivering her oracles in a state of trance. Great figures came to offer sumptuous gifts and inquire the divinity on strategic or personal issues, persuaded that the word of Apollo could influence their destiny. At the heart of these practices was a precise delineation of the sacred space, known as Hieria, indicating that it was a domain belonging to the gods. The temenos, or consecrated ground, was often marked by boundary stones or porticos to signify the break between the ordinary domain and that reserved for the deity. Inside stood the altars where sacrifices burned, along with regular processions punctuated by songs and prayers. The votive treasures, stored in dedicated buildings or displayed in the open air, demonstrated the gratitude of the faithful for a favor received. Bronze statuettes, adorned vases, or precious offerings could thus accumulate over the centuries, reflecting the collective history of the city and the piety of its great figures. In a sanctuary such as Olympia, dedicated to Zeus, the treasures of different Greek cities signaled their rivalry while affirming their common devotion. The priesthoods constituted essential civic duties, often occupied in turn by members of influential families. In certain cities, the priestly function did not require in-depth theological knowledge, but instead the ability to organize worship and perform rituals correctly. Priests and priestesses sometimes participated in the financial management of the sanctuary, overseeing endowments and offerings. The sums collected could be used to maintain the sacred buildings, fund festivals, or support the city's collective effort. At Eleusis, the cult of Demeter and Persephone involved the transmission of ritual secrets and initiations, requiring a greater degree of specialization. In all cases, priestly duties were closely linked to political life, as the same governing elites could also perform these religious functions, thus ensuring institutional cohesion. The notion of purity played a crucial role in Greek religion. The concept of miasma, meaning defilement, described any form of impurity related to a crime or sacrilege. Before coming into contact with the divine, the Greeks practiced lustrations, that is, purification rites using water or fumigations. Anyone deemed defiled had to perform these ablutions before crossing the sacred enclosure. Access rules could also concern sexuality or mourning, imposing waiting periods and purifications to prevent introducing impurity into the divine domain. In their view, maintaining this purity guaranteed the validity of the sacrifice and the benevolence of the deity. At the city level, religious organization influenced politics, law, education, and the arts. Magistrates, invested with public authority, presided over processions and ensured the proper conduct of celebrations. Oaths, crucial in Greek culture, were sworn before the gods, engaging the citizen's word before his peers and the celestial powers. Epics, sung in schools, taught the heroic tradition and glorified the great gods, thus shaping youth and their sense of honor. Sculptors and painters drew their inspiration from myths, translating the strength and ambivalence of the deities into images. In the theater, a semi-sacred space adjacent to the sanctuary, tragedies and comedies developed plots based on fate, divine justice, and human virtues, constantly reminding the audience of the gods' potential presence in daily life. In some cities, one could also find particular forms of divination, such as the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals. The haruspices, though foreign in origin for the Greeks, sometimes answered urgent questions by reading the signs left by the liver or other organs. Furthermore, observers would scrutinize birds, seeking to interpret their flights as celestial messages. All these practices reflected the constant desire to clarify divine will. The Greeks held great respect for these intermediaries, as a bad omen could lead to the cancellation of a military expedition or delay the departure of a fleet. In the society of the time, the boundary between the sacred and the profane was not clearly marked. Daily life was arranged around a permanent dialogue with the deities, and the need to sanctify each action testified to the concern of living in harmony with the cosmic order. The gifts offered to sanctuaries, or the solemn processions, thus served to renew the trust between the city and its gods. In the religious thought of ancient Greece, the underworld was a vast and complex realm ruled by the god Hades and populated by the souls of the deceased. To illustrate this invisible kingdom, mythographers evoked several mysterious rivers, including the Styx, depicted as a formidable body of water that the dead must cross to access the subterranean domain. The Acheron, often associated with the sorrow and laments of spirits, symbolized the dark and inescapable nature of posthumous destiny. Further still lay Tartarus, a dreadful abyss reserved for the worst criminals and deities cast into the depths after defying the divine order. In contrast to these terrible places, the Elysian fields promised a radiant existence to heroes and the righteous, welcomed in eternal peace. Charon, the ferryman tasked with guiding the shadows across the Styx, demanded payment in the form of an obol, a coin usually placed in the mouth of the deceased to ensure their passage. The myth of Demeter and Persephone illustrates how the Greeks linked life and death while explaining the origin of the cycle of the seasons. Demeter, goddess of the nourishing earth and harvests, lived in harmony with her daughter Persephone until the day Hades, taken by the young girl, abducted her to make her his wife in the underworld. Desperate, Demeter abandoned her divine duties and wandered the earth, weeping for her missing daughter. During her quest, she was welcomed by Celeus, king of Eleusis, whose hospitality softened her grief. It is in this context that, according to tradition, Demeter taught humans ritual agriculture, thus offering humanity the first knowledge of cereal cultivation and the organization of harvests. Eventually, a divine compromise was established. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother on the surface, ensuring the renewal of crops, and the other part in the shadow of the infernal world, causing winter and the temporary sterility of the earth. In this vast underground realm, the notion of justice occupies a central place through the relentless presence of the Erinyes, ancient deities born from the blood of Uranus. Often described as vengeful spirits, they tirelessly pursue those who have committed familial crimes, such as the murder of a parent or the violation of sacred rules. Their role aligns with that of the judges of the dead, responsible for assessing the soul after its last breath. According to some traditions, Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus, former virtuous kings, were placed at the head of this funeral tribunal. They examined the deeds of the deceased to assign the most virtuous to the fields of bliss, while the guilty suffered atrocious punishments in Tartarus. The Erinyes, sometimes called the Eumenides when appeased, thus embodied the shadow of divine justice, offering no out to those who would attempt to deceive the gods' morals. This rigorous conception of posthumous punishment served as a warning, influencing the behavior of the living. At the heart of this relationship between life and death, the Eleusinian Mysteries stood as one of the most important initiatory ceremonies of the Greek world, offering its adherents the promise of secret knowledge capable of improving their fate after death. These rites, celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone, took place each year in the city of Eleusis, not far from Athens. The initiates, bound by absolute secrecy, had to perform a preparatory ritual before entering the sacred sanctuary. It was said they were then confronted with mystical revelations about the nature of the life-death renewal cycle, reinforcing their belief in a form of posthumous rebirth. According to tradition, participating in these mysteries provided a particular protection in the afterlife, sparing the sufferings that other souls might endure. Hence, attending these ceremonies became an essential element of Greek piety, attracting both common citizens and notables in search of spiritual salvation in Hades' universe. Catabasis, the term for tales of heroes capable of descending into the underworld, reflects an imagination where the boundary between life and death could temporarily be crossed by exceptional beings. Orpheus, the legendary poet and musician, descended to the underworld, hoping to bring back his wife Eurydice, who had died from a snake bite. With the sweetness of his lyre, he softened the guardians of Hades and persuaded the dark god to let Eurydice go, on the condition that Orpheus not turn back before reaching the light. Heracles, the quintessential hero, also descended into the underworld to accomplish his final labor, capturing the dog Cerberus, guardian of the gates. As for Theseus, the Attic hero linked to the conquest of the Minotaur, he accompanied his friend Pirithous in an attempt to abduct Persephone, but failed and remained imprisoned until Heracles came to deliver him. Each of these incursions illustrated the extraordinary power and daring of these adventurers. Beyond myths, the daily life of the Greeks included a set of funerary practices intended to honor and perpetuate the memory of the deceased. Tombs, often marked by steles, decorated with family scenes or symbolic representations, testified to the importance given to remembrance. To commemorate the departed, the living organized funerary banquets, shared meals during which they ritually communicated with spirits. In some cities, the cult of heroized ancestors was part of this dynamic. The tomb of a founding hero, perceived as a protector capable of interceding with the gods, was venerated. This presence of the dead in the civic sphere reminded communities that death did not signify an absolute end, but rather a change of state. Thus, the steles, offerings, and funerary ceremonies sealed the link between past, present, and future generations, ensuring the longevity of the city and the stability of common values through a sacred relationship with time. This conception of the underworld played an essential role in defining the moral norms and expected behaviors within Greek society. The belief that judgment awaited everyone and that unforgivable misdeeds would be punished for eternity encouraged citizens to respect both divine and human laws. Simultaneously, the prospect of a reward in the Elysian fields or the possibility of spiritual liberation through the mysteries of Eleusis offered a positive motivation to act virtuously. Religious brotherhoods linked to initiation, such as those of Eleusis, continuously maintained, reinforced, and consolidated this connection between Earth and the hereafter, asserting that proper worship and justice rendered to the gods could ensure a form of salvation. In this way, the organization of the infernal world, cosmic narratives, sacred rituals, and the memory of heroized ancestors intertwined, deeply influencing collective life and how individuals envisioned their destiny as the hereafter governed the ethics of the living and founded religious brotherhoods. The ancient Greeks believed in entities located at the borders of nature and civilization, sometimes embodying bucolic rusticity, other times sexual impulse or artistic creativity. Pan, for example, was a rustic god, half man, half goat, a protector of flocks and shepherds, causing panic when he emerged from his sacred woods. The nymphs were feminine spirits linked to springs, trees, or the sea. Naiads, dryads, and nereids personified the living power of the earth and water. The satyrs, men with horsetails, and Seleni, their elders often depicted as drunk, were part of the retinue of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. Through their frenzied dances and immoderate laughter, these creatures expressed the raw forces of fertility and sensual joy. For a society that revered harmony, they nevertheless served as a reminder that celebration could turn to chaos if prudence and moderation were not maintained. Another category of hybrid creatures, the centaurs, powerfully illustrates the deep tension between self-control and impetuous violence. These beings, half human and half horse, inhabited the mountains of Thessaly. Most of them indulged in drunkenness, committing abductions and rampages, symbolizing uncontrolled animality. However, Chiron, the sole centaur renowned for his wisdom, offered a counter-model. Skilled in medicine and music, he taught young heroes like Achilles and Jason the art of temperance and how to perfect their qualities as warriors and diplomats. This duality crystallizes in the story of Nessus, who attempted to assault Deianira, the wife of Heracles, only to be pierced by the hero's arrows. The poisoned blood of Nessus would later cause the death of Heracles, proving that concealed brutality invariably corrupts the fragile balance between civilization and bestiality. The myths of centaurs thus express the radical ambivalence of man in the face of his desires and instincts. Tales of transformations often emphasize the punishment of pride or the transgression of divine prohibitions. Arachne, a young Lydian renowned for her weaving skill, challenged the goddess Athena by claiming to rival her art. Outraged by the technical perfection of the tapestry and by the insolent scenes Arachne had woven, Athena turned her into a spider, condemning her to weave endlessly without ever gaining glory or dignity from her work. Similarly, Actaeon, a reckless hunter, surprised the goddess Artemis while she was bathing nude. To punish this voyeuristic act, the goddess transformed him into a stag, and he was devoured by his own pack. Conversely, the nymph Daphne, pursued by Apollo under the influence of an arrow shot by Eros, preferred to implore her father Peneus to change her into a laurel tree rather than submit to the inescapable desire of the god. Each transformation expresses the fragility of humans confronted with the sovereign power of the Olympians. The confrontation between Marsyas and Apollo illustrates the limit that must not be crossed when a mortal challenges a god in his domain. Marsyas, a satyr skilled in playing the flute, dared to claim he could surpass Apollo, master of the lyre and guardian of cosmic order. Their musical duel ended with the crushing victory of the god, who punished Marsyas by flaying him alive. This profoundly cruel episode symbolizes hubris, the excess of trying to equal divine power. Apollo, associated with moderation and light, punishes anyone who disturbs his harmony. The cruelty of the punishment reflects the insurmountable distance between an immortal and an inferior creature, even if the latter excels on an artistic level. In the Greek context, this myth enforces vigilance against human presumption in challenging a sacred order. Through the staging of an extreme punishment, the ancients taught that genius and pride must always be accompanied by prudence and respect towards the gods. Love, on the other hand, seems to escape all logic. Eros, depicted as a winged child, emerges to inflame both mortal and divine hearts. His arrows, capable of inspiring uncontrollable desire, account for fatal passions or legendary idols. If one follows the late tradition, Eros himself felt a deep love for Psyche, a princess of exceptional beauty. Jealous, Aphrodite subjected her to daunting trials. Supported by Eros, Psyche succeeded in each task and eventually obtained immortality, demonstrating that the feeling of love can transcend the barriers separating the human from the divine. This myth, popularized by the Latin writer Apuleius in the 2nd century Anno Domini, resonates in many subsequent philosophical interpretations. The soul, which is the psyche, must undergo initiatory trials to rise spiritually. In archaic and classical Greek society, Eros's disturbing power explained the irrational force of desire, feared for its power to disrupt social balance and familial hierarchies while offering the promise of sublime ecstasy. In the Greek imagination, monsters themselves suggest a wild world that the hero attempts to discipline. The Gorgons, for example, are 3 winged sisters whose gaze petrifies anyone who looks at them. Perseus, aided by Hermes and Athena, manages to cut off the head of Medusa, the most famous among them, and uses it as a formidable weapon. The Harpies, creatures that are half woman, half bird, embody destructive rapacity. In the legend of Phineus, they spoil his meals until the intervention of valiant warriors. The Sirens, singing on dangerous rocks, lure reckless sailors, like Odysseus, who has himself tied to the mast, to resist succumbing to their sweet melody. As for the Chimera, a mix of lion, goat, and serpent, it ravages Lycia before being vanquished by Bellerophon and his steed Pegasus. These creatures personify the topography of ancestral fears, getting lost at sea, facing sudden death, or falling under the grip of unknown forces. Beyond these unsettling figures, Greek mythology insists on the initiatory value of these encounters. Pan and his Bacchic cohorts remind us that it is possible to find a form of joy in getting closer to nature while risking fatal excess. The centaurs show that one can cultivate intellectual virtuosity without extinguishing the animal part, provided one remains vigilant. Tales of Metamorphosis warn against pride or thoughtless transgression, where the nymph Daphne, through her refusal, illustrates the quest for freedom in the face of divine desire. With Marsyas, artistic prowess becomes a trap if it defies the recognized authority of the Olympians. Eros, on the other hand, intervenes as an irresistible force capable of elevating the soul to the sublime or plunging it into suffering. The monsters, by their mere existence, mark the boundaries between the civilized and the forbidden, inviting the hero to overcome fear or fascination. In this mosaic of stories, man learns to tame his impulses, to measure his pretensions, and to draw from these fables the wisdom necessary to inhabit a world where the fantastic meets the ordinary, in a surprising in-between. At the turn of the heroic age, ancient Greece sees the emergence of exceptional figures whose exploits shape the collective imagination and religious identity. The tales surrounding Perseus, Bellerophon, and Heracles are part of an oral tradition that draws from the sources of a distant past, before gradually being fixed in epic poems and artistic representations. Each of these heroes embodies ambiguous values: courage, strength, and cunning, coexisting with violence, fault, and the need for purification. Throughout their adventures, they face monstrous beasts and initiatory trials while founding or protecting human communities that later erect sanctuaries in their honor. The territories in which they travel, namely Argolid, Boeotia, Lycia, and the Aegean Islands, become stages to illustrate the superiority of extraordinary individuals, often endowed with divine lineage. The international public can thus discover, through these stories, how Greece intended to civilize its world by warding off chaos, while honoring the supernatural powers that surround it. Perseus, one of the oldest heroes in Greek mythology, sees his story begin even before his birth. His grandfather, Acrisius, king of Argos, received the oracle that he would be killed by a direct descendant. Fearing this fate, Acrisius locks his daughter Danae in a bronze tower or an underground chamber, depending on the version. Zeus, enamored by the beauty of the princess, transforms into a golden shower to join her. From this union, Perseus is born. When Acrisius discovers the child, he locks Danae and her son in a chest and throws it into the sea, hoping to thwart the fatal prophecy. The waves carry the chest to the island of Seriphos, where Polydectes, the local king, takes in Danae and the young boy. Over the years, the sovereign covets Perseus's mother and tries to divert the son by imposing an impossible mission: to bring back the head of Medusa, one of the three Gorgons. Medusa is famous for her snake-haired head and her gaze capable of petrifying any living being. To aid him in this desperate quest, the gods intervene. Athena offers Perseus a shield polished like a mirror, so he can approach Medusa without directly meeting her gaze. Hermes gives him winged sandals to cover immense distances, and other versions say he also receives the Cunei, the helmet of Hades that renders the wearer invisible. Perseus then goes to the Graeae, sisters of the Gorgons, who share only one eye and one tooth among them. By cunning, he confiscates their single eye to obtain the location of Medusa's lair. Caught in their sleep, the monsters are neutralized. Perseus decapitates Medusa, avoiding her gaze thanks to the reflective shield. From the wound flows the black blood of the Gorgon, and, in some versions, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor are born, fruits of a previous union between Medusa and Poseidon. Armed with his formidable trophy, Perseus takes to the air using his winged sandals. On his way back, he flies over Ethiopia, an ancient term for distant regions of Africa or the Near East, and discovers Princess Andromeda chained to a rock, offered as a sacrifice to a sea monster. The young woman's father, Cepheus, king of the country, obeys an oracle commanding him to deliver his daughter to appease the god's wrath. Perseus, struck by Andromeda's beauty, negotiates her hand in marriage in exchange for her rescue. He defeats the monster and frees the princess. During the wedding banquet, he is attacked by Phineus, a spurned suitor. Perseus then pulls out Medusa's head from his bag, petrifying the aggressor and his companions. Returning to Seriphos, he inflicts the same fate on Polydectes to protect Danae, before entrusting Medusa's head to Athena, who adorns her aegis with it. Ironically, to fulfill the original prophecy, Perseus eventually kills Acrisios, accidentally during an athletic contest, throwing a discus that fatally strikes his grandfather. His story illustrates the tragic dimension of fate in Greek mythology and the power of cunning against supernatural creatures. Bellerophon, another major hero, is associated with the city of Corinth, sometimes called Ephira in the Archaic period. His name is linked to the notion of slaying Bellerophon, an obscure character he supposedly killed accidentally. Forced into exile to cleanse himself of this murder, Bellerophon is welcomed by King Predates in Tiryns or another court, according to different traditions. Sthenoboia, also known as Antea, the king's wife, tries to seduce the young exile. After his refusal, she accuses him of having assaulted her. Proteus, unwilling to kill a guest, sends him to his father-in-law Iobates, king of Lycia. Wishing to rid himself of Bellerophon, Iobates assigns him supposedly impossible tasks, including confronting the Chimera, a fabulous creature part lion, part goat, and with a serpent's tail. To succeed, Bellerophon mounts the winged horse Pegasus, which the goddess Athena or Poseidon helps him tame. With this alliance, the hero manages to kill the Chimera by piercing it with his spear. According to some versions, he attaches a block of lead to the end of his weapon, and the heat from the beast's flaming mouth melts the metal, suffocating it. Bellerophon also repels warring tribes and vanquishes Amazons, bolstering his fame and convincing Iobates of his bravery. The king then gives him his daughter in marriage, making him an heir. However, succumbing to excessive pride, also known as hubris, Bellerophon convinces himself he can join the gods on Mount Olympus by flying on Pegasus. Zeus, angered by this presumption, sends a gadfly to sting Pegasus. Bellerophon falls, is gravely injured, and wanders, lonely, until the end of his life. The winged horse joins Zeus's celestial stable, becoming a symbol of inspiration and freedom in Greek imagination. Bellerophon thus embodies the dual nature of the hero, capable of extraordinary feats, yet one act of pride can lead to disgrace. Heracles, probably the most famous of the Greek heroes, was born from the union of Zeus and Alcmene, who was herself married to Amphitryon. To avenge her own affront, Hera throws the newborn into a succession of trials, seeking to kill him or drive him into madness. The cradle episode, where Heracles strangles 2 snakes sent by the goddess, foreshadows his exceptional strength. Later, struck by madness, he kills his wife Megara and his children. Overwhelmed by horror and guilt, he goes to consult the Pythia of Delphi, who orders him to serve King Eurystheus to atone for his crime. Thus begin the famous 12 labors, a cycle of formidable exploits intended to purify Heracles and bolster the reputation of Eurystheus, although the latter constantly lives in fear of the hero. The first of these labors is to defeat the Nemean lion, a beast invulnerable to ordinary weapons. Heracles manages to strangle it with his bare hands and uses the monster's claws to cut its skin as armor. The second is to kill the Lernaean Hydra, a multi-headed serpent, one of which is immortal. Aided by his nephew Iolaus, Heracles cauterizes each severed neck to prevent the heads from regrowing, then buries the immortal head under a rock. What follows is the capture of the Erymanthian boar, the capture of the Ceryneian hind, sacred to Artemis, the cleaning of the Aegean stables in a single day, the elimination of the Stymphalian birds, the capture of the Cretan bull, the taming of the man-eating mares of Diomedes, the conquest of the girdle of the Amazon queen Hippolyte, the capture of the cattle of Geryon, the fetching of the golden apples of the Hesperides, and finally the descent into the underworld to chain the dog Cerberus. Each labor demonstrates not only Heracles' physical strength, but also his ingenuity, as simple violence is not always enough. For example, to clean the Aegean stables, he diverts the course of a river so that the waters carry away the dung all at once. During these exploits, Heracles travels to the ends of the Greek world. He crosses oceans, confronts or forges alliances with fantastic creatures and minor deities, sometimes establishing sanctuaries or markers symbolically marking the boundaries of the known world. To the intensity of his struggles is added periods of service or penance, proving that brute power must submit, in Greek culture, to religious sanction and civic order. After each trial, Heracles is supposed to purify himself of the violence he exerted to avoid the taint that might befall the entire city. The notion of service and purification is fundamental to the concept of heroism at that time. Heroes are not just warriors or superhumans. They owe a form of spiritual debt to the community and the gods. Perseus, for instance, saves Andromeda and frees his mother, transforming him into a champion of the people of Seriphos. Bellerophon, despite his tragic end, contributes to the pacification of Lycia by slaying the Chimera. Heracles embodies the idea that personal ordeals lead to a role as a protector and founder of sacred rites. At each stage, the hero navigates between individual interest and collective cause, between bravery and civility, reflecting the constant tension between brute strength and the necessity for a harmonious social order. These heroic figures are honored with places of memory known as heroa, where the Greeks offer posthumous worship. A heron could be a simple sanctuary, a supposed tomb, or even a small temple dedicated. Communities would sometimes organize blood or honorific sacrifices, or even sports competitions, to maintain a sacred link with these mythical benefactors. Through these practices, the hero became an intermediary between the human sphere and the divine domain. His ardor, bravery, but also his moral flaws, allowed people to identify and discharge, through ritual, the tensions inherent in the mortal condition. The contests, often athletic or musical, celebrated the vigor and skill, fundamental characteristics of legendary exploits. The sacrifices, in turn, reaffirmed the community's gratitude for the hero's legacy, while seeking his favor and protection. A paradox emerges from these tales. The heroes are often guilty of violent crimes. Perseus petrifies his enemies, Heracles kills his family, Bellerophon murders, before his exile, a mysterious figure. Yet, they are celebrated as protectors and civilizers. In the Greek mindset, it is precisely this balance between destructive force and the ability to reintegrate through purification that defines heroic greatness. Never deified at the same rank as Zeus, Apollo, or Athena, the heroes are nonetheless positioned above ordinary human condition. They experience mortality, know suffering and fear, but achieve eternal glory, or kleos, which extends their fame long after their demise. For a contemporary audience outside of Greece, this ambiguity illustrates the symbolic richness of a culture that does not aim to present its heroes as infallible, but rather as archetypes rooted in both brutality and justice. Through local alliances, each city or region claims a founding hero. Perseus is thus linked to Argos and Mycenae. Heracles is often honored in Thebes, where he was said to be born, and in Olympia, where he supposedly established, according to some traditions, the beginnings of the games. Bellerophon, meanwhile, belongs to the memory of Corinth and Lycia, territories vying for the honor of having hosted or trained the hero. These multiple versions do not contradict each other. They rather reflect how Greek communities negotiated their identity by appropriating a famous figure. They could thus justify their prestige, political autonomy, or certain ancestral rights by claiming that an illustrious hero was their instigator. Cities sometimes forged symbolic alliances by agreeing on the story of the same hero, to reinforce a sense of brotherhood or to impose a common narrative on rival territories. All these practices attest to the importance of heroism in the religious, imaginary, and civic life of the Greek world, where stories and cults combined to grant the heroic figure an intermediary status, midway between human and divine, instability and order. In the history of ancient Greece, Theseus occupies a major place among the heroes. Born according to legend from Aegeus, king of Athens, and a Trojan princess, he was destined from childhood for an exceptional fate. The roads of Attica, often dangerous, were the initial theater of his bravery. On his way to join his father, he triumphed over bandits and local monsters, such as Procrustes, whose cruelty he corrected. These initial exploits already manifested his vocation as a protector and his role as a peacemaker in the region around Athens. The most famous episode associated with Theseus remains his intervention in Crete, in the palace of Knossos. According to ancient sources, Athens had to periodically deliver young people to King Minos as atonement for a past defeat. These victims were thrown into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature. Theseus, determined to free his people from this yoke, volunteered and confronted the monster. Thanks to the thread offered by Ariadne, daughter of Minos, he was able to find his way out of the maze after defeating the Minotaur. After this victory, Theseus left Crete with Ariadne. However, during the return journey, he abandoned her on the island of Naxos, a gesture whose motivations remain obscure and still provoke debates among commentators. Upon his arrival in Athens, he also faced a family tragedy. His father Aegeus, believing the hero dead, threw himself into the sea that now bears his name. Once king, Theseus undertook to unite the villages of Attica into a unified political entity, an act called Synoecism, thus making Athens a powerful center. Beyond Attica, other legends shape the heroic age, notably that of Cadmus and the foundation of Thebes in Boeotia. Cadmus, a Phoenician prince and brother of Europa, arrived in Greece in search of his sister abducted by Zeus. Guided by the Oracle of Delphi, he had to confront a dragon guarding a sacred spring. Defeating this monster marked the founding act of the city. On Athena's advice, Cadmus sowed the dragon's teeth, from which emerged the Spartoi, fierce warriors who fought each other until only a few survived, co-founders of Thebes. The lineage of Cadmus later led to the tragic cycle of Oedipus. Son of King Laius and Jocasta, he was abandoned as a baby to escape a prophecy that foretold he would kill his father. Raised in Corinth, he was unaware of his true lineage. Growing up, Oedipus inadvertently fulfilled the prophecy. He killed Laius during an altercation on the road, then solved the riddle of the Sphinx that was terrorizing Thebes. As a reward, he married Jocasta, not knowing she was his mother. This fateful union begat Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. Fraternal conflict arose when Oedipus, struck by the revelation of his involuntary crimes, left the throne. Eteocles and Polynices quarreled over the crown, each claiming sovereignty over Thebes. The strife led to the War of the Seven against Thebes, where Polynices allied with heroes from Argos. Ultimately, the two brothers killed each other, leaving the city exhausted. From this tragic episode emerged the figures of Antigone, who sacrificed her life to give Polynices a burial, and Creon, the authoritarian uncle, symbolizing civic intransigence against familial and religious laws. The Caledonian boar hunt, located in Aetolia, also illustrates the challenges heroes had to overcome to secure their fame. King Oeneus had neglected to honor the goddess Artemis, who then sent a gigantic boar to ravage the lands. A group of renowned hunters formed, including Meleager, son of Aeneas, and the skillful Atalanta, famed for her speed. They managed to track the beast, but the victory led to quarrels over the trophies, reflecting the conflicts of honor that characterized this violent age. The Amazons, mentioned in various epics, represent another fascinating aspect of Greek mythology. Depicted as a warrior society of women, they lived far from traditional Greek cities, often located on the shores of the Black Sea or in frontier regions. Their matriarchal organization and combat prowess inspired admiration as much as fear. Heroes like Heracles or Theseus had to confront them to prove their worth. These ritual encounters, tinged with violence, illustrate the confrontation between the Hellenic patriarchal order and an idealized or demonized feminine otherness. Hospitality, perceived as a sacred duty, was one of the fundamental principles of Greek life. Yet, some legendary figures grossly transgressed these rules and suffered exemplary punishments. Phineus, a Thracian king, mistreated his sons or abused his prophetic gifts, attracting the wrath of the gods who condemned him to blindness and eternal hunger, tormented by harpies. Tantalus, meanwhile, served the flesh of his child at a divine banquet and was condemned to endless thirst and hunger. Lycaon, king of Arcadia, offered human flesh to Zeus, provoking a punitive transformation into a wolf that marked the taint of his lineage. These stories, often imbued with violence and marvels, also served as symbolic foundations for Greek aristocracies and cities. Ruling families sometimes claimed descent from heroes like Theseus or Cadmus, thereby seeking to enhance their prestige and authority. Other myths justified the existence of institutions or civic rights, presented as the legacy of primordial heroic events. In Thebes, the descendants of Cadmus could claim a sacred legitimacy, while in Athens, the unification achieved by Theseus became a model for political cohesion. The myths thus reflected the ambition of cities to inscribe themselves in a prestigious continuity. The memory of these heroic exploits was perpetuated through the iconography and architecture of sanctuaries. On the pediments of temples, or the metopes of certain buildings, we recognize the combat scenes of Theseus against the Minotaur or the depiction of Cadmus slaying the dragon. Athenian potters, masters of black figure and red figure ceramics, decorated their vases with episodes like the Caledonian hunt or the battles with the Amazons. These images, exchanged and spread throughout the Mediterranean world, conveyed a common vision of the heroes and their bravery. Within the sanctuaries, votive offerings and sculpted reliefs commemorated the divine protection received by the cities. As they traveled through Attica, Boeotia, and other Greek territories, they found themselves amidst a legendary geography nourished by these foundational tales. Hills, caves, or fountains became places filled with stories where men honored the memory of heroes. Ceremonies organized around their tombs, or near sacred trees supposedly witnesses to an epic ingrained these adventures in the very topography of the cities. Foreign travelers then discovered through these monuments and celebrations the narrative power of such myths. The Greek landscape was profoundly transformed, becoming a vast theater where imagination intersected with politics and the sacred. The quest of the Argonauts is set in a legendary period before the Trojan War, when Jason, heir to the throne of Iolcus in Thessaly, is tasked with bringing back the Golden Fleece, This treasure is kept in Colchis, a distant kingdom bordering the Euxine Sea, known today as the Black Sea. To form his expedition, Jason assembles a crew of prestigious heroes called the Argonauts, named after the ship Argo, built by Argus with the protection of Athena. Among them are Heracles, already famous for his 12 labors, and Orpheus, a marvelous musician capable of enchanting both men and beasts with his divine lyre. Argo, according to legend, incorporated in its bow a sacred piece of wood from the sanctuary of Zeus at Dodona, giving the ship an oracular capability. The crew also includes Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, renowned for their bravery, along with other figures endowed with various talents. The journey begins at Iolcus, crosses the Aegean Sea, and then passes through the straits leading to the Bosphorus. The heroes must face the Symplegades, two moving rocks located at the entrance of the Black Sea. According to ancient belief, these blocks crash violently into each other whenever a ship tries to pass through. To overcome this danger, the Argonauts release a dove, observing its flight path before rowing with all their might to pass the obstacle at the right moment. After this formidable ordeal, the crew arrives in Colchis, where King Aeetes reigns, son of the sun god Helios. According to some traditions, he holds the golden fleece, which came from a miraculous ram that once saved the young Phrixus. Jason presents himself before Aeetes and asks him to relinquish this precious trophy. The king agrees on the condition that the hero undertakes several impossible feats: to yoke and master 2 fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, sow dragon's teeth, and then fight and defeat the warriors that spring from the earth. Without the intervention of Medea, the king's daughter, Jason could not overcome these insurmountable tasks. Medea, a priestess of Hecate and a feared sorceress, falls for Jason's charms under the influence of Aphrodite. Moved by desire and compassion, she betrays her father to assist the Argonauts. She gives Jason an ointment that allows him to withstand the flames of the bulls and teaches him the trick necessary to defeat the warriors born from dragon teeth: to throw a stone among them, causing them to turn against each other. Thus advised, Jason accomplishes the feat and demands the golden fleece. However, Aeetes breaks his promise, planning to kill the heroes before they can seize the treasure. Medea, now a staunch ally of Jason, helps him steal the golden fleece, which hangs on a sacred oak and is guarded by an invincible dragon. With a soporific potion, she puts the monster to sleep, allowing the Argonauts to escape. To delay the pursuit, some sources say that Medea kills her young brother Absyrtus and scatters his limbs at sea, forcing Aeetes to halt the chase, to collect his son and give him a proper burial. This extremely violent scene illustrates the determination of the sorceress, willing to commit the unthinkable to protect Jason. The Argonauts then return to the open sea, continuing their journey through regions unknown to the Greeks of the time. The figure of Heracles, though generally associated with the 12 labors, is part of the beginning of the expedition. However, according to some versions, he abandons the Argonauts along the way, highlighting the collective aspect of the adventure, where several heroes take turns facing dangers. Orpheus, on the other hand, calms the storms with his music and distracts the attention of hostile sea creatures. These companions pool their strengths, illustrating a pan-Hellenic cooperation. The return to Greece proves to be fraught with obstacles. The accounts diverge on the exact route, sometimes suggesting a drift to Libya or a crossing of territories north of the Black Sea. This geographical dispersion contributes to the legendary dimension of the epic and its universal scope. Once the ship Argo finally returns to Iolcos, Jason hopes to reclaim the power usurped by Peleus. According to some traditions, Medea persuades the daughters of Peleus to cut their father into pieces and plunge him into a magical cauldron to rejuvenate him. The sorceress thus manipulates their naivety, causing the king's death. Driven out of Thessaly for this crime, Jason and Medea take refuge in Corinth. There, Jason aspires to a higher status, abandoning Medea to marry the daughter of King Creon. Scorned and betrayed, Medea reacts with the most terrible vengeance, killing her children and destroying the future Jason had hoped for. This tragedy is powerfully recounted in Euripides' play Medea. The character of Medea concentrates several major themes: feminine cunning, betrayed loyalty, tragically broken filiation, and the exile of a rejected foreigner. By betraying her father and abandoning her homeland, she finds herself without support when Jason abandons her. Her ultimate act, infanticide, symbolizes the irremediable rupture with all forms of stability. Apollonius of Rhodes, a poet of the 3rd century before Christ, develops Medea's psychology in his Argonautica, emphasizing her inner struggle between familial duty and passionate love. Euripides, in the 5th century before Christ, explores the disastrous consequences of her wrath, depicting the portrait of a wounded woman who defies the male social order. This Argonautic quest, born by a rich epic, marked the Greek imagination as a foundational narrative. The Argonauts embody the idea of a temporary union of heroes from various cities, jointly achieving an extraordinary feat. The myth also contributes to the legendary mapping of the Black Sea and Caucasus, territories perceived as exotic and dangerous. The Symplegades, the fiery bulls, the guardian dragon, and Medea's bloody escape are all remarkable stages that have inspired poets, playwrights, and artists. Furthermore, this episode illustrates the regular intervention of the gods, notably Aphrodite, who ignites Medea's passion, thus decisively influencing the course of history. Later rewritings offer varied interpretations. Some authors highlight collective heroism, others emphasize Jason's fault in betraying the woman who saved him. Others still underline the crucial role of Hera, Jason's protector in some versions. The figure of Orpheus also connects the quest to the tradition of sacred poetry, where song can alter reality. In any case, this adventure expresses the complexity of relations between mortality and divinity, as well as the power of magic. The crew of the Argo thus becomes a recurring symbol, that of a group chosen for an initiatory quest, where self-surpassing is accompanied by betrayals, sacrifices, and wonders. Beyond the myth, the Golden Fleece has sometimes been interpreted as a memory of practices for collecting gold flakes in the rivers of the Caucasus, where sheepskins were used to trap the gold. Symbolically, the journey reflects the Greeks' thirst for exploration, curious about the eastern lands and drawn by the supposed riches of these regions. On a literary level, this story has nourished tragedy, epic, and mythography, offering an inexhaustible material for reflecting on questions of loyalty, love, power, and destiny. Medea, the abandoned sorceress, embodies the dark reverse of the adventure, while Jason and his companions leave the vibrant image of an initiatory journey that became immortal. The Trojan cycle traditionally opens with the lavish wedding of Peleus, king of Thessaly, and the Nereid Thetis, a marine goddess renowned for her beauty and metamorphic abilities. Although the main ceremony unfolds under the benevolent gaze of the Olympian gods, an unexpected discord occurs when Eris, the goddess of discord, is denied access to the banquet. Furious at being excluded, she throws a golden apple into the midst of the guests, bearing the inscription "to the fairest." Quickly, 3 goddesses claim it: Hera, wife of Zeus, and protector of marriage, Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, and Aphrodite, embodiment of love and seduction. To resolve this conflict, Zeus chooses to entrust the judgment to the Trojan prince Paris, also known as Alexander. Amazed by Aphrodite's promise to grant him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, he awards the trophy to the goddess. This seemingly innocuous act triggers a chain of events leading to the great conflict known as the Trojan War. In the wake of this choice, Aphrodite honors her promise by designating Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, as the most beautiful woman on earth. Already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, Helen is famous for her unique grace and prestigious lineage. During a diplomatic visit to Sparta, Paris seduces Helen, who agrees to follow him to Troy, taking advantage of the temporary absence of her husband. This abduction, or consented flight according to some sources, marks the breaking point between the Achaean cities and the powerful city of Troy, located on the western coast of Anatolia. Furious at the affront suffered, Menelaus calls for help from his elder brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and recognized leader of several Greek cities. At this moment, an ancient oath, once sealed among Helen's suitors to protect the honor of the chosen husband, reactivates. The great kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece, united by this pact, prepare for war and thus form the formidable Achaean coalition. Among the most prominent figures in this Greek assembly are heroes whose exploits will become legendary. Agamemnon, ambitious and determined, leads the alliance by virtue of his status as the most powerful king in the region. His brother Menelaus, directly offended by Helen's abduction, harbors a burning desire for reconquest and revenge. Achilles, son of the mortal Peleus and the goddess Thetis, shines as the greatest warrior of his generation, thanks to his exceptional strength and the protection offered by immersion in the waters of the Styx. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, brings his cunning intelligence and strategic talent, which will prove decisive on multiple occasions. Alongside these charismatic leaders are also Ajax the Great, renowned for his imposing stature and bravery, and Diomedes, whose valor in battle grants him a heroic status of the highest order. Each contributes their qualities to form the military and moral backbone of the Achaean army. On the other side, the city of Troy is not lacking in champions or allies. Hector, eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, embodies Trojan honor with his keen sense of duty and attachment to defending his homeland. A valiant warrior, he enjoys deep respect among his people and adversaries alike. Aeneas, sometimes presented as a close relative of the royal house, stands out for his piety and privileged connection with the goddess Aphrodite, who is said to be his mother according to some accounts. Sarpedon, from the lineage of the god Zeus, leads the Lycian contingents allied with Troy and illustrates the international dimension of the conflict. A large coalition, composed of other Anatolian cities, lends assistance to resist the Achaean invasion, reinforcing the geopolitical complexity of the conflict. Each side thus relies on heroes with semi-divine status, creating a balance of forces conducive to a war whose impact will transcend centuries. Before the confrontation even begins, several ominous signs foretell bloody trials. As the Achaean fleet gathers at the port of Aulis, the contrary winds inexplicably delay the departure. Interpreting this phenomenon as the wrath of Artemis, Agamemnon consults the seer Calchas. He reveals that the goddess demands a sacrifice to appease her anger. Agamemnon, already guilty of offending Artemis during a hunt, accepts the terrible act. He offers his own daughter, Iphigenia, as a sacrifice, although some versions of the myth claim that Artemis saves her at the last moment by replacing her with a deer. At the same time, it is said that the violation of a priestess of Pallas, committed by a Greek warrior, further adds to the divine wrath, arousing Athena's resentment. From then on, persistent oracles reinforced the certainty of a long and arduous war, marked by divine interventions, family torments, and internal rivalries within the Greek coalition itself. When the Achaean fleet finally reaches the Trojan shores, the first phase of the conflict is characterized by a series of sieges, individual duels, and raids intended to weaken the enemy's logistics. The walls of Troy, reputed to be impregnable, defy every direct assault, forcing the Greek leaders to adopt harassment strategies. Quick incursions into allied cities and expeditions to supply the army punctuate this period, creating a rhythm of endless skirmishes. Achilles, fiery and feared, confronts the best Trojan warriors with the help of swift patrols, while Odysseus orchestrates ruses to destabilize the enemy. The gods of Olympus, engaged by affinities or grudges, actively participate in the struggle. Apollo supports the Trojans, irritated by sacrileges committed by the Greeks, while Hera and Athena, offended by Paris's choice, lend their assistance to the Achaeans. The battlefield then becomes a theater of conflict where the human and divine worlds merge. In this climate of violence, certain heroic ideals assert themselves as ethical benchmarks for the combatants. The notions of kleos, the glory gained through memorable deeds, and time, the personal value recognized by one's peers, fuel the ardor of the leaders and the loyalty of their subordinates. Aristeia, that moment of martial superiority, is the subject of tales sung by bards and shapes the fame of the greatest warriors. Achilles, determined to leave an indelible mark, fights in pursuit of honors, supported by his friend Patroclus, whose fidelity sublimates a fraternal ideal. Beyond the military sphere, the Trojan cycle also strengthens the cultural cohesion of a still fragmented Greek world. Epic poems circulate during gatherings, linking listeners through a shared imagination. Each city-state, whether modest or powerful, sees itself in this tapestry of tales, gradually forging the Hellenic identity. The heroes, both divine and mortal, become archetypes embodying the aspirations and fears of an entire civilization, without obscuring the capricious hand of the gods. From the very first songs of the Iliad, the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon crystallizes around a captive named Briseis. This young woman, taken during a raid on a city allied with Troy, is awarded as a prize to the hero Achilles in recognition of his exploits. When Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and supreme leader of the Greek coalition, is forced to return another captive protected by the god Apollo, he decides to demand Briseis as compensation. Outraged by this act, which he considers an affront to his honor, Achilles withdraws from the battle. His abstention, in a war where every champion counts, significantly weakens the Greeks against the Trojans. The battles continue, but the absence of the best Achaean warrior allows the city's defenders to gain ground. As for Achilles, he retreats into his anger and asks his mother, the marine goddess Thetis, to call on Zeus to inflict heavy losses on the Achaeans, so they may feel the gravity of the committed affront. The escalation of the conflict, marked by divine resentment, sets the stage for the impending tragedy and heralds the central role played by the hero in the outcome of the war. Patroclus, close companion and intimate friend of Achilles, witnesses the massacre striking the Greek camp. A surge of empathy arises. He pleads with Achilles to lend him his armor to boost the army's morale. The ruse is simple but effective. Clad in the armor of the Peleus' son, Patroclus makes the Trojans believe that Achilles has finally returned to the fight. The effect is immediate, and the defenders of Troy retreat in shock. However, swept up by the fervor of the battlefield, Patroclus advances too far, all the way to the walls of Troy. He is ultimately killed by Hector, the most valiant of the Trojan princes and protector of the city. Patroclus' death has a seismic effect on Achilles. He awakens from his initial anger to embrace a new rage directed at Hector. Driven mad by vengeance, he takes up arms again, donned in a new set of armor, forged by the god Hephaestus at the request of Thetis. His fury is devastating, and he sows panic among the Trojan troops who retreat behind the high walls. Hector, however, does not flee permanently. Unlike other fighters, he chooses to stand his ground against the enemy champion, aware that his city needs a final bulwark. Their spectacular duel, narrated with intensity in the Iliad, symbolizes the opening towards the conclusion of hostilities. Achilles, transcended by his thirst for vengeance, slays Hector under the eyes of his family, who observe from the ramparts. The Trojan warrior dies as a hero, imploring for a dignified treatment of his body. Achilles, blinded by rage, then ties Hector's lifeless body to his chariot and drags it around the walls, a gesture of great cruelty for the time. Yet, after the intervention of King Priam personally visiting the Greek camp to ransom his son's corpse, Achilles regains a bit of humanity. He returns the body and accepts a truce allowing for the celebration of grand funerals. This moment of pietas, where a father pleads with his son's killer, remains a key passage of the epic, testifying to the shared code of honor between the two camps. Even in the most extreme rage, the possibility of a brief agreement remains possible, dedicated to the respect for the dead and the pain of the survivors. After Hector's death, the Trojan resistance endures, but Troy is now deprived of its main defender. Several divine interventions and a succession of skirmishes follow, until Achilles himself falls under the arrows of Paris, Hector's brother. In the most common tradition, the fatal blow is guided by the god Apollo and strikes Achilles' heel, the only vulnerable point of the hero, immersed by his mother in the magical waters of the Styx. The loss of Achilles among the Greeks is enormous. Ajax the Great, Achilles' cousin and second most formidable hero, covets the divine armor forged by Hephaestus. However, Ulysses, also known as Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, manages to convince the Greek leaders that the armor should go to him rather than Ajax, arguing his superior intellectual abilities. Mad with shame and despair, Ajax commits suicide, further depriving the Greek army of a peerless defender. Meanwhile, in suffering Troy, the captive Andromache, Hector's widow, awaits the fate the victors will grant her. Prince Aeneas, cousin of Priam by blood, already contemplates leaving the city to find a future elsewhere. In certain sources, he is designated as a son of the goddess Aphrodite, which would presage an extraordinary destiny and the future founding of a new people. The trick of the wooden horse, often attributed to Ulysses' ingenuity, constitutes the decisive stratagem of Troy's downfall. The Greeks, pretending to abandon the siege, leave a gigantic wooden horse on the shore, presented as an offering to the goddess Athena. The Trojans, not inclined to suspicion, debate on what course to follow. Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam, gifted with the power of prophecy but condemned never to be believed, begs her compatriots to destroy this suspicious statue. Similarly, the priest Laocoon attempts to warn the people, even going as far as to hurl a spear against the flank of the horse. Apollo, who safeguards the larger divine plans, then sends 2 monstrous serpents to kill Laocoon and his sons, a sign the Trojans mistakenly interpret as confirmation that the horse must be honored. The city then opens its gates and brings in the trapped object. By nightfall, the warriors hidden inside the horse emerge, open the city gates to their allies who have returned in secret, and Troy is set ablaze. This final act seals the fate of the great city of Ilion, a high place whose walls, according to legend, had been built with the help of the gods Poseidon and Apollo themselves. In the dramatic moments of this fall, the Trojan population is decimated or reduced to slavery. Andromache, already tested by the loss of Hector, becomes a captive of Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, while Hecuba, the queen, is taken as a prisoner. Cassandra, still ignored despite her visions, is assigned to Agamemnon, foreshadowing new tragedies in his house. Aeneas, for his part, manages to escape with a small group of survivors, carrying his father Anchises on his shoulders. This flight will become the basis of a literary tradition developed multiple times, in which Aeneas would lay the foundations of future Rome, a story that the Latin poet Virgil will recount in the Aeneid. Thus, the Trojan royal lineage would perpetuate itself far from the Aegean shores, in another part of the Mediterranean world. The consequences of the war do not stop at the mere destruction of Troy. Agamemnon, a major actor in the Greek victory, returns to Mycenae with Cassandra as a captive. There begins the tragedy of the house of Atreus, marked by a long series of family revenges. Clytemnestra, wife of Agamemnon, has harbored a fierce hatred against her husband for years, whom she accuses of having sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, at the start of the expedition to obtain favorable winds. Upon his return, Agamemnon is murdered in his own palace, sometimes depicted as being stabbed in the bath or trapped in a net. Cassandra, who predicted her own fate, is also killed. This act of violence triggers a new vengeful mechanism. Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, decides to avenge his father by killing his mother. With the help of his sister Electra, he commits matricide. However, this murder against the mother, considered abominable to the ancients, attracts the wrath of the Erinyes, chthonic deities, sometimes called Furies. Pursued by these powers of vengeance, Orestes finds salvation only by obtaining a trial in Athens. It is the play Eumenides by Aeschylus that recounts the judicial conclusion of this bloody vendetta. Through this trial, the goddess Athena institutes a human tribunal, the Areopagus, to judge Orestes. The Erinyes then transform into the Eumenides, benevolent deities, symbolizing the transition from a blood-based vengeful justice to a justice founded on law and legal debate. After the fall of Troy, the various Greek leaders disperse, each embarking on a journey back to their homeland. These return voyages are encompassed under the Greek term nostoi, meaning the returns. For some, the journey takes place within a reasonable time frame, despite a few adventures. Menelaus, husband of Helen, wanders at sea for several years before reaching Sparta. Nestor, sovereign of Pylos, strong in age and under the protection of the gods, returns relatively quickly to his kingdom. Others experience shipwrecks or longer drifts, like Diomedes, who ends up on distant shores and struggles to regain his place in Argive society. Odysseus, for his part, will undergo the most famous adventures, recounted in the Odyssey. He will wander for 10 years before reaching his island of Ithaca. These nostoi highlight the cosmic and divine dimension of the conflict. The tangle between mortals, started on the beaches of Troy, is overseen by the gods, who sometimes impose additional trials for those who have committed sacrilege or cruelty. The fall of Troy and the scattering of the heroes also have repercussions in the collective memory. Antiquity perpetuated the memory of the great departed through heroic cults. In these practices, monuments or sanctuaries called hieroons are erected to venerate a figure considered to have transcended human condition. Cities often compete to boast of holding the tomb of a famous hero. Claims around the tomb of Achilles, for example, or those of Ajax, enhance the prestige of places that can host pilgrims or commemorative ceremonies. The funerary games, organized in memory of the deceased, are also a strong marker of this culture. In the Iliad, a famous sequence shows Achilles instituting athletic contests in honor of Patroclus, adorned with sumptuous prizes and followed by the entire warrior community. Subsequently, many Greek cities repeated this model, integrating events marked by a religious character and a heroic remembrance into their festivities. Tomb relics, whether real or legendary, become spaces where offerings, wreaths, sometimes even miniature weapons are deposited. The goal is to perpetuate the spirit of the hero, whether it is a mythical parent founder of the city or a figure associated with warrior and moral values. This ritual memory, which involves concrete gestures and public commemorations, ensures the continuity between the exploits of the mythical past and the collective identity of subsequent generations. An epic poem attributed to the Greek poet Homer, the Odyssey narrates the adventures of Ulysses, king of Ithaca, who tries to return home after the Trojan War around the 12th century before Christ. The 10 years of his wanderings are marked by perilous trials and the wrath of Poseidon, offended when the hero blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. However, Ulysses benefits from the support of Athena, goddess of wisdom, who guides him through many obstacles. The Odyssey of this king is thus constructed between divine pitfalls and providential aids, in a universe where balance often depends on the whim of the gods. A first trial occurs on the island of the Cyclopes. Curious, Ulysses and his companions venture into the lair of the giant Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Trapped in his cave, they see the entrance blocked by a rock. To escape, Ulysses deceives the monster by calling himself nobody and inebriates him with a potent wine. The creature, blinded in his sleep, calls for help from his peers, but screams that nobody attacked him, sowing confusion. The sailors flee by hiding under the bellies of the rams, thus escaping the Cyclops and sealing Poseidon's enmity. Fleeing this terrible encounter, Ulysses arrives on the island of the sorceress Circe, where several sailors are transformed into pigs. Protected by a remedy given by Hermes, the hero forces Circe to break the enchantment. Seduced by his courage, she advises him, warns him that he must consult the seer Tiresias in the land of Hades, then sends his troop towards new challenges. Ulysses stays a year with her, torn between comfort and nostalgia for Ithaca. At the end of this stay, he sets out in search of the prophecies essential for his return, always confronted with divine whims. Guided by Circe, Ulysses then goes to the kingdom of Hades to consult Tiresias. Through ritual libations, the soul of the prophet reveals to him Poseidon's irrevocable anger. Back on the ocean, he faces the fatal song of the sirens, which he masters by plugging his companion's ears and having himself tied to the mast of the ship to resist the enchantment. Then comes the narrow passage between Charybdis, a devastating whirlpool, and Scylla, a six-headed monster that captures several sailors. Despite all his strategies, Ulysses cannot avoid these painful losses, but he continues his journey, eager to return home. After successive shipwrecks, Ulysses is stranded alone on the island of the nymph Calypso. In her arms, time stretches. The divine hostess offers him immortality, but he dreams only of Ithaca and his wife. Calypso eventually gives in under Zeus's injunction. Ulysses builds a raft and returns to the sea, still pursued by Poseidon's resentment. Finally finding refuge with the Phaeacians, he reveals his identity and recounts his adventures. Moved, these expert navigators bring him back to the shores of Ithaca, unaware of the dire fate that Poseidon's revenge will bring upon them. In Ithaca, for 20 years, Penelope has been pushing back suitors determined to seize the throne. Her cunning plan involves weaving a shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, while undoing the work at night that was done during the day. This stratagem, extended over years, delays the remarriage imposed on her. However, treacherous maidservants reveal the deception, intensifying the pressure. Nonetheless, Penelope remains courageous, and convinced of Odysseus's return. Her son Telemachus, now an adult, struggles to manage these intruders while the palace's atmosphere deteriorates. This fragile balance foreshadows an inevitable confrontation where the wife's faithfulness will finally be rewarded. Returning incognito, Odysseus disguises himself as an old man to judge everyone's loyalty. Aided by Athena, he first meets Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, then Telemachus, who recognize him as the true master of the house. Only an old maid identifies his scar, a souvenir from a boar hunt. To finish off the suitors, Penelope organizes a contest, stringing Odysseus's bow and shooting an arrow through 12 aligned axes. Only the hero succeeds in this feat, revealing his identity. With Telemachus and a few allies, he executes the invaders, restoring order in the palace. This victory, bloody but legitimate, marks the triumph of a king returning to his throne, ready to restore the trampled justice. Hospitality, or xenia, appears as the most central moral value of the Odyssey. It requires feeding the traveler, just as the latter must honor his host. The Cyclopes violate this principle by devouring guests, and Ithaca's suitors break it by shamelessly occupying Odysseus's home. In contrast, Circe and then the Phaeacians eventually welcome the hero properly. The narrative emphasizes the fragile balance between respecting this sacred rule and the punishments incurred when it is transgressed. This code forms part of divine justice, as poor hospitality or abuse is seen as offenses to the gods. Thus, the reconquest of Ithaca illustrates the restoration of xenia in the face of usurpation. The protection of Athena remains fundamental in Odysseus's journey. In the form of a mentor or silent inspiration, she favors discernment and encourages cunning instead of brute force. Meanwhile, Poseidon, offended by the wound inflicted on his son Polyphemus, seeks to annihilate the traveler by unleashing storms and opposing currents. This divine opposition provides dramatic relief to the story, as Odysseus remains immortal, subjected to the pantheon's wills. An offense against a god generally implies punishment unless another god chooses to protect the guilty. Thus, Odysseus's maritime journey resembles an initiation trial, where skill and caution prevail over blind bravery. Each stage reminds him of the need to master his pride and maintain a fair measure to survive divine traps. The Archaic period, which spans approximately from the 8th to the 6th century before Christ, marks a decisive turning point in the cultural history of the Greek world. At this time, city-states called polias are structured, new institutions appear, and literary production gains prestige. In this climate of renewal, mythology undergoes a progressive process of codification, notably thanks to the writing of major works. Oral stories, previously passed from bard to bard, take shape in poems attributed to two prominent figures, Homer and Hesiod. Sung verses, accompanied by instruments, become pillars of public and religious life, as well as vectors of collective memory. Homer, a semi-legendary figure, is said to be the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two fundamental epics where gods and heroes mingle in a world in search of glory and destiny. The Iliad depicts the conflicts around the city of Troy, while the Odyssey recounts Odysseus's wanderings after the war. These poems, initially transmitted orally by bards and then rhapsodes, receive a written form in the Archaic period that establishes their authority. Hesiod, for his part, bequeaths us the Theogony and Works and Days, didactic poems where the origin of the cosmos, divine genealogy, and moral advice occupy a central place. Thanks to these authors, the mythical tradition acquires unprecedented solemnity and becomes a shared identity foundation. In parallel with the two great epics, the Homeric hymns developed specifically to celebrate the gods of Olympus. Composed at various times, they honor Apollo, Demeter, Hermes, and Aphrodite, describing their attributes, domains, and key moments of their sacred history. Interpreted during religious festivals or public ceremonies, these texts strengthen the bond between the community and its protective deities. They often begin with a solemn invocation, followed by an ideological narrative explaining the origin of a cult or the establishment of a sanctuary. Thus, the Homeric hymns structure the ritual staging and reinforce the sacred dimension of civic gatherings. During this same period, Greek cities undertook waves of colonization across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Attracted by new agricultural lands and commercial opportunities, they founded settlements often fortified and led by leaders called oikists. These leaders, generally invested with religious sanction, were perceived as heroic figures bearing divine protection. In these new settlements, the gods of the metropolis continued to be honored, and original myths spread to regions distant from the Aegean cradle. Sanctuaries rose, cults adapted to the local environment, and Greek civic customs took root in contact with diverse populations. Parallel to territorial expansion, mythical iconography set itself in a new visual language, notably thanks to the black figure vases produced in the workshops of Athens or Corinth. These potteries, intended for banquets or as cult offerings, illustrate legendary episodes from the Homeric narratives, such as the tension between Achilles and Ajax, or the exploits of Heracles. Artists adopted pictorial codes, recalling the distinctive features of each hero or deity, allowing spectators to easily recognize the scene. This visual standardization reinforces the dissemination of myths and their pedagogical function, while reflecting the aesthetic tastes of the period. Furthermore, legislators and thinkers of the archaic era relied on mythological narratives to illustrate moral and social rules. Some famous legislators, such as Lycurgus in Sparta or Draco in Athens, established severe laws sometimes justified by the example of exemplary heroes or the fear of divine sanctions. In the cities, the education of young citizens included the memorization of Homeric poems, as these narratives contained lessons of courage, fidelity, and prudence. Myths thus became an integral part of collective learning, serving as an ethical guide and ideological cement to forge civic identity and maintain group cohesion. If there is another form of poetic expression during the archaic period, it is certainly lyric poetry, composed to be sung or declaimed at festive gatherings, banquets, or competitions. Among the important names, Pindar in the 5th century before Christ stands out with his Epinetian poems intended to celebrate the victory of athletes at great Panhellenic games, such as those of Olympia or Delphi. In these odes, he connects the sporting glory of champions to mythical heroes, explaining that their current prowess fits into a legendary continuity. Lyric poets convey collective values, exalt piety towards the gods, and highlight the virtues of an orderly life. Myth remains an inexhaustible reservoir of exemplary models. The archaic period also saw the emergence of a more factual form of storytelling, mythography. While earlier poets focused on sung poetry and the exaltation of divine exploits, some authors undertook to compile genealogies, inventory royal lineages, and provide rational explanations for wonders. Sometimes, they established catalogs of heroes, detailing their parents, children, and the cities they founded. This systematic approach sought to inscribe the legendary tradition into a more coherent framework, allowing political elites to claim prestigious ancestors. Mythography thus began a form of proto-history, where writing codified the intangible heritage of the Greek world. In some later writings, there emerges a desire to confront myth with pragmatic observation. The budding rationalizations involve explaining legendary battles or fabulous creatures as mere metaphors for real events, such as a war between two clans or the discovery of an unknown animal. The goal is not to invalidate the sacred aspect of the narrative, but rather to reconcile ancestral beliefs with an increasingly argument-driven worldview. Such interpretations indirectly nourish the historical discipline, as they encourage distinguishing between fable and chronicle, while recognizing the identity value that legend held for communities in the archaic era. This evolution of narrative forms coincides with the diversification of writing supports, made possible by the more widespread use of papyrus and the increased stability of the Greek alphabet. The first lists of gods, heroes, or royal dynasties circulate within scholarly circles, while erudites already specialize in the criticism of sacred texts. Mythographers sometimes explore the etiology behind certain cults, arguing that a particular sacrifice dates back to an ancestral charisma, or that a holy place commemorates the supposed tomb of a civilizing hero. As this practice of systematic compilation develops, mythology becomes part of a broader framework where the investigation of the past aligns with the sacred imagination. This phenomenon anticipates the rise. Ancient narratives thus begin to be transmitted in a more controlled manner, paving the way for multiple future reinterpretations, expansions, and adaptations. In the 5th century before Christ, classical Greece experiences an unprecedented cultural flourishing dominated by the power of Athens and the emergence of new political frameworks. In this context, the Athenian city, with its nascent democracy, becomes a major hub for the performing arts, philosophical reflection, and the rise of a constructive critique of myth. Citizens, gathered during large collective festivals, attend dramatic performances that openly question religious and legendary heritage. In this world undergoing political transformation, mythic traditions do not disappear. On the contrary, they transform into prisms to understand the relationships between the human, the divine, and the city. Tragic poets then become the first interpreters of this recontextualization, while remaining faithful to the heroism of ancestral narratives. When discussing tragedy during this period, 3 names immediately stand out: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Each rewrites classical myths to address issues directly concerning the Greek society they observe. In Aeschylus's work, the Oresteia, performed around 458 before Christ, the curse of the house of Atreus is explored while questioning divine and human justice. On stage, the Erinyes chase Orestes, guilty of his mother's murder, and the tragedy highlights the long road leading to the establishment of a civic tribunal. The spectators hear an echo of debates on law and the need to put an end to family vendettas to build a common judicial system. Sophocles, in turn, tackles drama in stories like Oedipus Rex. He presents fate trapped within a prophecy while illustrating human blindness in the face of oracles. Athenians see in it a warning about political arrogance or the pretense of controlling everything. Euripides, later on, stands out for his heightened psychological sensitivity. In his Medea, presented around 431 before Christ, he shows a murderous heroine, a victim of Jason's infidelity, who kills her own children. This tragedy, heavy with passion and fury, offers a new perspective on the feminine figure and the irreducible suffering she can endure before turning against the society that humiliated her. These tragedians, while wielding the narrative power of myth, focus on highlighting its moral and political mechanisms. The gods do not vanish from the stage, but their presence is reconsidered with regard to communal justice and civic fears. With each performance, the assembly experiences a form of catharsis. The emotions stirred by the dramas, such as fear, pity, and anger, are purged, with social issues sublimated on an artistic level. At the same time, politics intertwines with religion, as these plays are performed during the Great Dionysia, festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, and theatrical trance. Through tragedy, the collective explores major human faults, confronts the violence of vengeance, and seeks paths to institutional reconciliation. Myths, thus revisited, become mirrors where Athenians can reflect on their fears and ideals. Simultaneously, comedy is experiencing significant growth, especially under the pen of Aristophanes, active during the late 5th century before Christ. This author interweaves political satire, burlesque humor, and the reappropriation of mythological themes. He does not hesitate to caricature heroes, make gods converse with ridiculous mortals, or mockingly address the Peloponnesian War. In certain plays, like The Birds, staged in 4 and 14 before Christ, he envisions the founding of a utopian city in the sky where gods could be bypassed. By transposing myths into a ludicrous framework, Aristophanes offers a sharp critique of civic life and its excesses, reminding us that these stories, known by all, can serve to unveil the absurdity of certain human pretensions. The audience, composed of citizens seated in the stands of the theater of Dionysus, thus receives a political message tinged with humor. The gods and heroes become vectors for reflection on the collective destiny and on finding a balance between tradition and progress. With the rise of rationality, philosophers begin questioning the foundations of myth more directly. Even before Socrates, in the 6th century before Christ, pre-Socratic thinkers from Ionia had started an initial critique, preferring to explain nature through physical principles rather than the capricious will of gods. But it is in the 5th century before Christ that Xenophanes of Colophon issues one of the first direct attacks against anthropomorphism. For him, it is illogical to imagine gods in human form, as each people project their own traits onto their deities. The Ethiopians, he says, depict them as black, while the Thracians conceive them as red-haired and blue-eyed. This questioning of the human projection into the divine opens the way to a more general reflection on the origin of myths and their truth value. From then on, legends are no longer seen as intangible stories, but as the product of human inventiveness. Following this, Plato, in the 4th century before Christ, places myth within a philosophical framework. In his dialogues, notably The Republic, he proposes allegories that, while drawing on mythical images, seek to illustrate conceptual ideas. The allegory of the cave, for example, describes prisoners seeing only shadows and suggests a rational quest for truth. However, Plato is also highly wary of traditional stories, describing gods as envious or ungrateful beings. He calls for certain tales to be censored, deemed dangerous for the education of young citizens. In his ideal city, myths should be purified of any moral corruption. Beyond this prudence, we notice in Plato a recognition of the pedagogical potential of ancient fables, provided they are used as metaphors for higher realities. Aristotle, his disciple, develops the notion of mimesis, artistic representation, in his Poetics. He does not condemn myth, but is interested in how the poet imitates reality, sublimates or transfigures it, to provoke in the audience an identification and understanding of human passions. According to him, it is indeed the poet's skill in articulating a coherent narrative that paradoxically makes fiction more universal and more intelligible than factual history. The artistic movement of the classical period is particularly reflected in sculpture, which reaches a high degree of formal idealism. Sculptors such as Polykleitos or Phidias seek to represent gods and heroes according to precise aesthetic canons. What matters is the search for perfect harmony between the body's proportions and the expression of an inner strength. Polykleitos, in his lost treatise called the Canon, describes a system of measurements linking each part of the body to the whole, illustrating his theories in the statue of the Doryphoros, known as the spear-bearer. The Olympian deities are thus frozen in poses imbued with calm and majesty. The contrapposto, which involves shifting the body's weight onto one leg, confers a new vitality to sculptures and symbolizes the potential greatness of humanity. These statues sublimate myth by making it visually admirable and emphasizing the almost unattainable perfection that man attributes to his gods. Heroic iconography multiplies in temples, pediments, and friezes, as evidenced by the decorations of the Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens. There, we find mythical scenes illustrating either the protection of Athena or the exploits of emblematic warriors, depicted as the spiritual ancestors of the city. The approach to history also transforms under the influence of two great authors, Herodotus and Thucydides. Herodotus, born around 484, before Christ, describes himself as an investigator and is interested in the causes of the Persian Wars, opposing the Greeks and the Persians. His accounts frequently incorporate mythical or legendary elements he gathers during his travels, from Egypt to the edges of Asia Minor. He does not always question the veracity of these traditions, preferring to present them as cultural testimonies. In contrast, Thucydides, active during the Peloponnesian War in 431 before Christ, intends to be more critical. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, he deliberately excludes legends to focus on verified facts and the rational causes of the conflict. He believes myths, too closely tied to poetic tradition, can obscure the understanding of events. This approach marks an important step in the separation between historical science and mythical argumentation, even if Thucydides acknowledges the psychological and political importance of the beliefs shared by his contemporaries. In terms of civic religions, the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ are marked by an increased sophistication of rituals and the spectacular staging of major festivals. The Panathenaic Games, celebrated annually in Athens, honor the goddess Athena with solemn processions, athletic contests, and musical performances. Every 4 years, a larger version of these festivities, also called the Greater Panathenaic Games, attracts considerable crowds. The Great Dionysia, meanwhile, includes not only rites dedicated to Dionysus, but also theatrical performances of tragedy and comedy. During these celebrations, contests are organized where poets must present their works before a jury and the masses of citizens. The gods receive libations, offerings, and hymns, while the crowd thrills to the rhythm of the sung verses and dramatic plots. This festive world, at once religious and civic, ensures a wide dissemination of myths revisited by the stage while reaffirming Athenian identity. Rituals, so frequent in the Hellenic calendar, serve as a social and political link. They allow for the cohesion of a community, sometimes plagued by rivalries between factions, especially during war tensions with Sparta. Through tragedy, comedy, philosophy, art, and history, myths become an immense reservoir of scenarios that lead to reflection on justice, the nature of power, the condition of women, or the violence inherent in humanity. The stories of Oedipus, Orestes, or Medea go beyond the narrow framework of merely retelling archaic legends. They offer extreme cases, exemplary or tragic figures, allowing thinkers and artists to explore the question of fault, fate, and redemption. In many plays, blind revenge or divine wrath are questioned to better highlight the virtues of moderation and reason. Audiences of the time then discover how myths can serve as both a warning and a moral prod for decision-makers and ordinary citizens. A tool for questioning, critique, and dialogue, it reflects the tensions of a civilization in full effervescence, ready to analyze its gods and heroes to better understand itself, while maintaining the sacred flame of its traditions. The Hellenistic period, extending from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century before Christ, is characterized by a profound transformation of the Greek world following the conquests of Alexander the Great and the division of his empire. After Alexander's death in 323, his generals divide the conquered territories, giving rise to several powerful kingdoms. The Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, and Antigonid Macedonia then emerge as major centers of cultural and religious production. At the heart of this ferment, Alexandria, a capital founded by Alexander in Egypt, becomes the symbol of erudition and intellectual curiosity. By the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, the library and the museum form a unique hub dedicated to knowledge. Famous scholars like Callimachus undertake to classify and comment on the most varied texts. Apollonius of Rhodes composes his epic poem, the Argonautica there, which offers an elegant version of the quest for the Golden Fleece. Philology truly emerges in this context, thanks to scholars who compare different manuscripts and attempt to establish the best possible version of mythological, poetic, or scientific writings. Callimachus, a great poet and librarian, for example, creates an impressive catalog to classify the available works, while Apollonius re-examines heroic legends to propose more coherent narratives. These studies refine the understanding of myths and influence how the educated population approaches cosmology, divine genealogies, and historical narratives. The phenomenon of religious syncretism, characteristic of the Hellenistic era, feeds on the confrontation and fusion of local traditions with the Greek pantheon. In Egypt, under the Iliad dynasty, the figure of Isis enjoys growing popularity and blends with Hellenic elements to create new cults. Serapis, created from Osiris and Apis, symbolizes this mixture. He is venerated both as an Egyptian deity and as an incarnation of the Greek god Pluto, ensuring benevolence and prosperity. The Hellenistic rulers, seeking to consolidate their power, also encouraged the divinization of the monarch. In Egypt, the Ptolemies present themselves as the direct heirs of the pharaohs, adopt their ceremonies, and erect temples to manifest their sacred status. The same phenomenon occurs in other kingdoms. Antiochus the Thars of Commagene, in Anatolia, erects colossal statues on Mount Nemrut, celebrating his own divine ancestry. This political sacralization shapes a form of cultic kingship, where the king merges with tutelary figures. At the same time, religious practices evolve to meet the thirst for personal salvation. The mysteries of Samothrace, on the North Aegean island, gain in popularity. They promise protection at sea and deliverance from earthly trials. The Orphic order, already ancient, reinvents itself in esoteric forms, offering its adepts the hope of a better life after death. These movements encourage a form of more individual piety centered on initiatory ritual and intimate proximity to the divinity. This search for direct connections with the divine is reflected in the iconography of the time. Sculpture and painting gain in expressiveness, depicting gods and heroes with moving faces, bodies often idealized but adopting dynamic poses. The childlike Eros, represented as a young winged boy, embodies a gentler, more personal cult of love. Draperies become more elaborate, emphasizing movement and dramatic tension. Artistic pathos reinforces the feeling of an immediate communion with the sacred. In this climate of multiple influences, we witness the emergence of Euhemerist thought, named after Euhemerus of Messene, a philosopher of the 3rd century before Christ. According to him, the gods of mythology were originally just remarkable human beings, kings or heroes, whose memory was then deified. This theory responds to a desire to rationalize the legendary heritage by placing it within a historical framework. Thus, Zeus, Hera, or Poseidon would be the mythical ancestors of ancient dynasties, exalted by tradition. This movement of rationalization does not erase the vitality of beliefs, as myth remains a universal mode of expression, especially in the new Greek territories of Asia, Egypt, or the Near East. In the cities founded by Alexander's successors, the local pantheon sometimes merges with Greek deities, forming hybrid cults. Dedications reframe Astarte, a Phoenician deity, in a Hellenic context, or assimilate Baal-Shemin into Zeus. These fusions ensure the cohesion of diverse communities by providing a common religious language. The trade routes, particularly those connecting the Aegean Sea to the Red Sea or India, facilitate the circulation of religious ideas. Astrology, born in Mesopotamia, penetrates more deeply into the Greek world and transforms into a scholarly discipline. Planets become associated with gods, and major celestial conjunctions spark mystical interpretations. The zodiac, inherited from Babylon, spreads in the Hellenistic cities, thus creating a shared symbolic framework to describe individual and collective destiny. In this vast mosaic, literary production diversifies and multiplies variations on mythological narratives. The scholars of Alexandria or Pergamon compose not only epic poems but also treatises combining mythology and philosophy. Traditional fables are transformed into moral allegories, while competing versions of the same legends circulate in literary circles. Tragedies lose importance, supplanted by new genres, such as the New Comedy of Menander, which sometimes inserts mythical references to enrich its plot. In parallel, compilations and catalogs contribute to partially fixing the mythological heritage. From the end of the 3rd century, Greek grammarians gather lists of deities, heroes, cities, and lineages to make the immense corpus of legends more accessible. Among these synthesis works, a library often attributed to Apollodorus of Athens catalogs the principal divine and heroic stories, from the creation of the world to more recent times. Although the exact author remains debated, this text acquires quasi-canonical authority. These collections have the effect of fixing certain versions to the detriment of other oral or local traditions. Compiler authors, often supported by royal patrons, seek to impose a unified narrative. The multiplicity of mythic variants, visible in archaic poetry or classical theater, is then re-evaluated according to criteria of universality and coherence. Hellenistic readers, whose level of education rises, wish to find clear landmarks. Thus, writing becomes a means to standardize and unify the collective imagination. In this context, myths continually interact with new beliefs, whether they are more esoteric mystery cults, royal worship, or Euhemerist philosophy. The Hellenistic world thus establishes a bridge between ancient tradition and a burgeoning intellectual modernity, without a definitive conclusion. As the Roman Empire gradually extends across the Mediterranean basin, a phenomenon of appropriation of Greek religious traditions takes place. It is commonly called interpretatio Romana, that is, the systematic identification of foreign deities with Roman equivalents. This approach is rooted in Rome's religious flexibility, which, since the Republic, has regularly integrated cults from other cultures. Now, Jupiter takes the place of Zeus as the sovereign master of the sky, while Venus extends the attributes of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Similarly, Mars joins Ares as the god of war, and Mercury adopts the traits of Hermes, the winged sandal messenger. This convergence of pantheons is encouraged by imperial power, as it contributes to the construction of a common identity. Under Augustus, who reigned starting in 27 before Christ, the idea of a cosmic and universal Rome is reflected in official discourses, which highlight the kinship of imperial Rome with heroic Greece. Mythological symbols, partially Romanized through their new nomenclature, then serve to legitimize the ruling dynasty. Court poets, orators, and artists adapt Hellenic legends to praise the fortune of the empire, thus unifying Greek imagination and Roman pride into a coherent whole, serving imperial propaganda. At this same time, Latin literature incorporates the poetic heritage of Greece. Virgil, the official poet of the Augustan regime, composes the Aeneid between 29 and 19 before Christ. He recounts the journey of Aeneas, a Trojan prince surviving the war, who becomes the mythical ancestor of Rome. This narrative establishes a direct link between the fall of Troy, already celebrated in the Iliad, and the future founding of the Roman city. The epic then serves the new regime as an ideological foundation to exalt Rome's providential vocation. A few decades later, Ovid, active under Augustus but later exiled by imperial decree, delves into an even broader universe with the Metamorphoses, published around 8 Anno Domini. His work, a mix of Greek stories and Italian legends, becomes one of the richest compilations of ancient mythological tales. Each episode illustrates transformations, divine punishments, or simple wonders. The poet includes famous myths such as Daphne and Apollo, Narcissus, Philemon, and Baucis, thus anchoring in Latin culture a vast narrative toolbox. From late antiquity onward, the Metamorphoses are copied, commented on, and reinterpreted, traversing the centuries as one of the most influential literary sources in Europe. The success of these great texts also extends to the private sphere, where numerous mythological representations flourish in Roman homes. Multicolored wall frescoes adorn the villas of Pompeii and Herculaneum, frozen under ashes during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 Anno Domini. On their walls, one discovers the goddess Venus emerging from the waves, the nymph Io watched by Argus, or even the amorous adventures of Zeus Jupiter. Mosaics designed with tiny tesserae decorate the floors of luxurious reception rooms. Again, Greek and Latin gods coexist, often surrounded by pastoral scenes, marine creatures, or floral motifs. In wealthy houses, cameos or intaglios and carved semi-precious stones depict the features of Minerva, Athena, or Diana, Artemis, worn as jewelry as tokens of esteem and refinement. Urban elites, particularly in large provincial cities, compete to display legendary motifs within their atriums and peristyles, reflecting their belonging to a shared imperial culture. Myths, once sung in Aegean palaces or celebrated in city-states, now find their way into the daily life of Rome and its provinces, both in private and public spaces. At the same time, some authors search for the authenticity of the ancient Greek sanctuaries. Among them is Pausanias, a geographer and traveler of the 2nd century Anno Domini, who traverses mainland Greece and the Aegean Sea to compose his Description of Greece. This work, in 10 books, compiles an impressive amount of information on monuments, temples, and local legends. He records, for example, the cult statues of Delphi, details the offerings preserved at Olympia, visits the sacred caves of Arcadia, and cites oral traditions related to deities or founding heroes. For each city, he presents the most commonly told version of the myth, mentions variants, describes the rituals still practiced or in decline, and emphasizes the importance of heroic cults. Thanks to him, readers of the Roman Empire and much later eras have a true guide to understanding the roots of certain religious festivals, the layout of sanctuaries, or the origins of local tales. By relying on a multitude of sources, Pausanias becomes the custodian of a memory that is both literary and cultic, a unique witness to the mythological survivals in their original environment. In the intellectual context that dominates this period, Neoplatonism emerges as a new philosophical impetus for the scholars of late antiquity. Heirs to Plato's ideas from the 5th century before Christ, the Neoplatonists readily incorporate Greek myths into their teachings, but divert purely literal interpretations to turn them into allegories. Proclus, in 412, Anno Domini, the last great representative of the Neoplatonic school of Athens, thus examines the great mythological recitations to discern a spiritual structure. According to him, the stories of Hesiod or Homer are not merely ancient folklore or poetry, but contain veiled truths about the soul, the sensible world, and the divine intellect. Iamblichus, in the 3rd century Anno Domini, also develops this vision by linking certain divine figures, like Zeus or Demeter, to metaphysical principles. Throughout their treatises, myth becomes a vehicle for esoteric knowledge, a key to achieving the contemplation of higher realities. This philosophical approach, which colors the Greek tradition with a mystical hue, will durably influence later interpretations, even in the Christian and medieval realms, even if the original religious reading of these stories is gradually supplanted by philosophical allegory. However, the rise of Christianity, especially from the 4th century Anno Domini, introduces a rupture in this spiritual horizon. Emperor Constantine, whose reign began in 306, marks a turning point by recognizing the Christian faith as legal. Then Emperor Theodosius III in 379 proclaims it as the state religion. Within this new configuration, many church fathers openly criticize the old polytheism. Tertullian in the 2nd century denounces the superstition and idols he sees in pagan statues and rituals. He considers mythological legends as contrary to Christian morals, sometimes labeling them as diabolic deceptions. Augustine of Hippo, himself trained in classical rhetoric, provides in his City of God lengthy refutations of traditional myths and beliefs. He explains that the multiplicity of gods of antiquity is just a false image of the sacred, a baseless scattering in the face of the divine unity of Christianity. Tales of extramarital love or violence, frequent in Greek myths, serve him as examples to show the moral corruption projected onto the gods themselves. Consequently, the formal practice of these ancient cults undergoes successive bans. Imperial laws, like those promulgated under Theodosius, condemn traditional sacrifices and progressively nullify the privileges of pagan priests, leading to the closure or conversion of many temples. Despite this hostility, the mythical heritage does not entirely disappear. Rather, one observes a reorientation of meaning. In some cities, statues of gods are recycled as ornamental figures, or are changed to glorify the Christian sovereign, while former sanctuaries are transformed into churches. Myths, once transmitted orally within the framework of rituals or civic festivals, continue to live through grammar and rhetoric schools. Teachers study Homer, Hesiod, the tragics, and Latin poets like Virgil or Ovid, if only for the learning of language and literary composition. Moreover, some Christian authors, while disapproving of ritual practice, retain a taste for classical culture. Mythological references appear in apologetic works or sermons that reinterpret pagan symbolism to better celebrate the supremacy of the one god. Controversies are thus enriched with mythical citations used to illustrate this or that moral argument, as many exemplary tales now deemed pagan, but potentially useful for the edification of the believer. The last link of this preservation lies in textual transmission. The ancient schools, which often remain until the 6th century in the Eastern Roman Empire, which is the Byzantine Empire, train cohorts of students accustomed to copying and commenting on the great authors. Grammar treatises exploit legends to teach syntax or etymology, while rhetoric professors rely on Homeric speeches to stimulate oratory skills. Abstracts, sometimes called scholia, compile key episodes and divine genealogies to facilitate study. More summary synopses allow students to memorize the main lines of the myth rather than read the vast poems in full. This practice ensures, over the long term, the survival of narrative traditions. As Christianity asserts itself and civic life is organized differently, the sacrifices and public cults attached to Olympian religion become rare or transform into mere folkloric remnants. But the substance of myths remains in the books. Copied from one scriptural workshop to another, supplemented by scholars' commentaries, they travel from one library to another and thus span the ages. The ceremonies that once brought them to life are no longer permitted or lose their meaning in a society now shaped by a conquering monotheism. Yet, despite the prohibition of many pagan rites, the intellectual attraction for authors like Ovid, Homer, or Euripides does not completely wane. Explored either as moralized fables or as allegories, these legends become a rich symbolic material, more consulted than honored according to ancestral tradition. They thus pass under the scholar's pen and within circles of erudites, where encyclopedias and anthologies perpetuate a mythological knowledge intended to feed curiosity and reflection, much more than to orchestrate a living and shared cult. In the Latin Middle Ages, the heritage of Greek mythology survives mainly through the texts of Latin authors that have been copied, adapted, or commented on by clerics and learned individuals. Ovid, a Roman poet of the 1st century before Christ, occupies a central place in this transmission. His Metamorphoses, copied in monastic scriptoria, are read according to a reading framework called Ovid Moralisé. In this perspective, ancient stories about gods and heroes are reinterpreted from a Christian angle. Each mythical adventure becomes an allegory of a moral principle, a vice, or a virtue, allowing a spiritual lesson to be disseminated in the medieval Christian context. In parallel, numerous encyclopedias, such as those by Isidore of Seville in the 6th century, or that of Vincent of Beauvais in the 13th century, compile bits of Greco-Latin traditions, sometimes classifying them alongside biblical stories and examples from Roman antiquity. These works, intended to educate clerics or nobles, offer encompassing knowledge in which mythology is just a part of a grand, universal narrative. References to figures like Minerva, Venus, or Jupiter often serve to illustrate aspects of the human condition, and mythological scenes painted in certain manuscript margins testify to a purely decorative or didactic use. In this context, most references to Greek mythology blend into the vast symbolic program of Christian discourse, giving rise to allegorical survivals whose exact meanings sometimes elude non-initiated readers. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the original Greek texts due to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the influx of Byzantine scholars into Italy. This phenomenon revived the direct study of ancient sources, not just in Latin, but also in the original language of Homer, Hesiod, or the Athenian playwrights. Italy, and particularly Florence, became the epicenter of this humanist movement, which regarded antiquity as an artistic and intellectual model. Neoplatonic circles, encouraged by patrons such as the Medici, engaged with Greek myths from a philosophical perspective inspired by Plato's works. In this spirit, Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century commented on the myths as narratives containing hidden truths, both aesthetic and metaphysical. Renaissance art, characterized by the desire to imitate ancient splendor, fully integrated mythology. The paintings of Sandro Botticelli, like The Birth of Venus around 1485, reinvent the goddess of love in the context of celebrating beauty and harmony. Titian, for his part, explored themes inspired by Ovid, notably in his paintings of Danae or Venus, where the female nude is exalted under the guise of mythology. Artists and scholars sought to reconcile the Christian heritage with ancient ideals by using an iconography where Persephone, Apollo, or Dionysus accompany in palaces and paintings the heroes of the Old and New Testaments. Throughout Europe, educated sovereigns welcomed humanists capable of reading and explaining Greek texts, promoting the diffusion of a neo-Hellenic culture reflected in architecture, sculpture, and the celebration of perspective. This rediscovery, marked by a quest for authentic sources, linked Greek mythology to the renewal of arts and letters. In the classical age, and even more so in the Enlightenment, the perception of Greek mythology evolved towards critical rationalism. Scholars attempted to understand ancient narratives in the light of reason, sometimes demythologizing them. Fabulists like Jean de La Fontaine in the 17th century adapted motifs from antiquity to convey moral messages. Some of his texts draw directly from Aesop or Greco-Roman myths, but the divine dimension is often diminished in favor of practical and moral instruction. Meanwhile, antiquarian scholarship developed, especially within French and English academic circles. Texts by Homer, Hesiod, or the tragedians were scrutinized for historical or philological information, considering mythology as a reservoir of clues about ancient civilizations. Scholars created comparative tables, reread Pausanias, and questioned the reality of Atlantis or the veracity of the Trojan siege. Myth often served as a pretext for discussions on the nature of power, the role of the sacred, or the origins of religions. With the philosophical spirit of the 18th century, a form of deism emerged, attempting to uncover a natural religion behind polytheistic mythology. The stories of divine love affairs and epic conflicts became supports for enlightened satire. Literary salons and theaters revived the gods of Olympus in the form of opera ballets, gallant tragedies, or poetic librettos, while attenuating the sacred dimension in favor of a scenic and enjoyable one. At the beginning of the 19th century, a profound transformation took place, driven by Romanticism, a movement that flourished throughout Europe, from Germany to England and France. For Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, mythical Greece became a cultural and poetic ideal that inspired his dramas and poetry, as can be felt in Iphigenia in Tauris, or in his epistolary exchanges where he celebrated the harmonious beauty of antiquity. Friedrich Hölderlin, animated by an almost mystical fervor, perceived Greek mythology as the source of an intense spiritual and poetic experience. In England, Percy Bysshe Shelley invoked divine and heroic figures to express his libertarian visions, sometimes transforming ancient narratives into a denunciation of the society of his time. Mythology then mingled with the quest for freedom, passion, and the transcendence of the self, so dear to the Romantics. At the same time, although Richard Wagner's music drew primarily from Germanic legends, it found resonance in Hellenic theatricality. The scenic cycles conceived in Bayreuth evoked how ancient Greek theater might have been staged in the classical era, with a comprehensive ambition, blending drama, music, and philosophical thought. Myth, henceforth, was invested with an aesthetic and spiritual mission. It became a vector of creative momentum, an epic breath allowing artists to defy established frameworks and probe human impulses through powerful imagery. In the 19th century, the human sciences were structured and provided a new framework for the study of Greek mythology. Linguists and philologists, such as Franz Bopp or Jacob Grimm, studied the common roots of Indo-European languages, seeking to elucidate the origins of Hellas by crossing linguistics and mythology. Max Muller, philologist and Orientalist, developed a comparative theory according to which many myths originated from solar or climatic metaphors created by Indo-European peoples and transformed over time. In the field of religious anthropology, Edward Tyler and James George Fraser focused on rites and beliefs, attempting to show that Greek legends shared a common basis with other so-called primitive traditions. Fraser, in his famous work The Golden Bough, published in several volumes between 1890 and 1915, multiplied comparisons between ancient mythology and ritual practices observed in geographically distant societies. This endeavor broadened the perspective of study. The gods of Olympus were related to universal symbols, and the stories of Athena, Hermes, or Hera appeared as so many mythical responses to fundamental questions about life, death, and fertility. The nascent studies of folklore also turned to Greek popular myths, perceived as living witnesses of the oral traditions that fed the Homeric epic. The rise of archaeology, supported by European patrons and encouraged by the awakening of a national sentiment in several countries, offered new material evidence to rely on for rereading Greek mythology. Heinrich Schliemann, passionate about the Iliad and the Odyssey, began excavating the site of Troy in present-day Turkey in 1870, convinced of discovering the fortified city of King Priam. His discoveries, despite a methodology sometimes contested, sparked worldwide enthusiasm and reinforced the idea that there was a historical basis behind certain legendary episodes. Schliemann also unearthed royal tombs at Mycenae, including the famous mask of Agamemnon. His enthusiasm sometimes deceived scientific prudence, but he gave impetus to more systematic excavations. At the beginning of the 20th century, Arthur Evans uncovered the Palace of Knossos in Crete between 1900 and 1905. The frescoes, pottery, and labyrinthine architecture contributed to rekindling interest in the myth of the Minotaur and the Minoan gods associated with the bull. The excavations highlighted the existence of great Aegean civilizations, whose memory would have crystallized through narratives like that of Theseus. Publications and excavation reports quickly circulated in Europe, transforming mythology into a hybrid domain, both literary, historical, and archaeological. Many enthusiasts flocked to Greece, visited the sites, and tried to link every hill, every ruin, to an epic adventure or divine intervention. At the turn of the 20th century, new disciplines shed an original light on Greek myths by exploring them through the lens of psychology or sociology. Sigmund Freud, in his early theories of psychoanalysis starting in 1899-1900, popularized the Oedipus complex, one of Sophocles' most famous tragedies, to express the child's unconscious rivalry with the parent of the same sex and its desire toward the parent of the opposite sex. Carl Gustav Jung, a student then dissident of Freud, drew from the tales of heroes and gods to illustrate his universal archetypes, which he saw at work in the collective unconscious. Greek myths now serve as much as clinical examples as they do literary models, proving their flexibility in the face of modern approaches to the psyche. Simultaneously, we see the beginnings of structuralism, with scholars who were already trying, before Claude Lévi-Strauss, to identify fundamental structures, prefigurations in mythical narratives. educational systems began to include mythology in literature or history courses, sometimes in the form of illustrated manuals, aimed at a broad public curious to understand Zeus, Hera, or Achilles. In popular arts, theater and opera take hold of the great narratives. European theaters become fascinated with Ulysses' returns, Antigone's tragedies, and the thwarted loves of Orpheus and Eurydice. Directors and composers use these universal references to evoke emotion, reflection, or social critique. Poets, writers, and even caricaturists reappropriate divine figures to make them allegories of power or the human condition, proving that Greek mythology, far from being frozen in the past, remains an inexhaustible resource of images and symbols, adaptable to every era.